close your eyes and let yourself be carried back, not in any hurry, not with any urgency, but gently, the way a boat drifts from a dock when someone has simply untied the rope and let the water do the rest. Tonight we are going to travel together to a world so old that even its ruins have crumbled into dust, and yet a world so vivid, so warm, so full of small human sounds and smells, that with a little stillness you can almost find yourself inside it. And if these slow night journeys are the kind of thing you like to fall asleep to, there is a channel here where you can find them again and again, night after night, always waiting for you like a lamp left burning in the window. So do consider finding it and keeping it close, so you never have to search too long for a story when the dark comes. And to anyone listening right now, wherever in the world you happen to be, whether you are in a quiet city or somewhere the stars are very bright and very near, do leave a word in the comments. Just a small one, just the name of your town or your country, because somewhere in the world right now, there are hundreds of others lying in their beds doing exactly what you are doing, and there is something quietly beautiful about knowing that. But now, let us go back. Let us go a very long way back. The world we are entering tonight is the 4th century before the birth of Christ. Think of that for a moment. More than 300 years before the calendar we now use had even begun its counting. More than 2,300 years before this very night. And yet the sun rose over the Mediterranean then in exactly the way it rises now, a slow orange swelling at the eastern edge of the sea, spreading gold across water that was already ancient when the people of this story were alive. The Mediterranean. Say the word slowly, and let it open in your mind like a map drawn on old papyrus. That vast inland sea, blue-green and restless, ringed all around by the pale edges of 3 continents, dotted with islands that sit like sleeping animals in the haze of summer heat. The smell of this world is the first thing to understand, because smell is the oldest sense, the one most connected to memory and to the deepest layers of the mind. The ancient Mediterranean smelled of salt and stone, of wild thyme crushed underfoot on hillsides that were white with limestone dust, of olive groves, always olive groves, their silver-gray leaves trembling even on days when there seemed to be no wind at all, their gnarled trunks as old as the villages they surrounded, as patient as mountains. The olive was not merely a food in this world, it was life itself, pressed into oil that lit the lamps in every home, rubbed into the skin of athletes, offered to the gods, traded across the sea in fat-bellied clay amphorae that bobbed in the holds of merchant ships. To live in the ancient Mediterranean was to live inside the faint, golden, slightly bitter fragrance of olive oil, as constant and as unremarkable as the smell of rain is to us. And the sound of this world, the sound was water, always water, the slap of small waves against the wooden hull of a fishing boat in the gray hour before dawn, the trickle of a spring emerging from the rock of a hillside, channeled into a stone trough where women came each morning to fill their clay vessels, setting them on their heads, and walking home with the unhurried grace that comes from a lifetime of practice. The creak of a water wheel in Egypt, turning endlessly in the green margin of the Nile, lifting the river into the fields that the river itself had built over thousands and thousands of slow, generous floods. In the cities, the fountain at the center of the agora, the open marketplace, ran all day and into the night. And the sound of it was the sound of civilization itself, the sound of water tamed and offered and shared. Those cities, let us rest in them for a moment. In the 4th century before Christ, the great cities of the Mediterranean world were already ancient and already extraordinary. Athens on its rocky peninsula still shone with the memory of its golden age, the Parthenon gleaming white on its hilltop, though it was already 1 or 2 generations old by the time our story begins, already a landmark rather than a novelty. The Athenian agora in the morning was a place of profound human texture, merchants unrolling bolts of dyed cloth, fishmongers crying out over their glistening catch, philosophers walking in unhurried circles with their students trailing behind them like ducklings, the clang of a bronzesmith's hammer from a side street, the bleating of a goat being led reluctantly through a crowd that parted and closed around it like water. The air above the city was sharp with charcoal smoke and the sweet rot of fruit, and the particular dry warmth of sun on old stone. To the south and east, across the sea, lay the Persian Empire, and here the scale of things changes entirely. The Persians ruled over a world that made Greece look like a collection of small quarrelsome villages, which in some ways it was. From the shores of the Aegean in the west to the edges of India in the east, from the Caspian steppe in the north to the deserts of Egypt in the south, the Persian king, the king of kings as he was called, presided over a realm of almost incomprehensible size and variety. His roads were the finest in the world, wide and well-maintained, running thousands of miles, marked at regular intervals, with stations where fresh horses waited. His couriers could carry a message from the western edge of his empire to his palace at Susa in a matter of days that would have seemed miraculous to a Greek traveler on foot. His capitals, Persepolis, Susa, Ecbatana, Babylon, were cities of a grandeur that the Mediterranean world could barely imagine. Their walls hung with glazed tiles the color of deep water and new grass, their gardens watered by hidden channels, their throne rooms lit by hundreds of lamps that turned the polished gold and silver of the walls into something very close to daylight, even in the darkest hour of the night. And Egypt, always Egypt, older than everything, patient and strange, settled along its great river like a civilization at rest after a very long effort. The Nile in the 4th century before Christ was what it had always been, the absolute center of every Egyptian life, the reason for every field and every city, the measure of every year. When it rose, it brought life. It left behind the dark, rich mud in which everything grew in extraordinary abundance. Wheat, barley, linen, papyrus. The Egyptians of this time were already ruled by a Persian governor, their Pharaonic dynasties interrupted by foreign power. But the great temples still stood, their walls covered in paint that had not yet faded, the incense still burning in the dim, pillared sanctuaries, the priests still moving in their white linen robes through the same rituals that had been performed in the same places for more than 2,000 years before even this ancient world was young. This is the world, then, a world of warm stone and cool water, of olive oil and incense, of sailing ships and dusty roads, of marketplace arguments and temple silences, of kings who ruled over millions, and ordinary people who rose at dawn to tend their small fires and grind their grain, and watch the light change on the hills they had known their entire lives. It is a world where the night sky was enormously important because there was no other light, where the stars were navigation and religion and story all at once, where a clear night meant something different and more immediate than it does for most of us now. The lamp in a window, the torch in a doorway, the fire in the courtyard, these small flames were precious things, carefully tended, because darkness in this world was genuinely dark and light was genuinely hard-won. It is into this world, this salt-smelling, olive-scented, water-murmuring, fire-lit world, that a child will soon be born in a rough highland kingdom to the north of Greece, in a place of cold winters and mountain silences, and hard men who ate and drank beside their horses. And that child, in the fullness of time, will walk through every one of these landscapes we have been imagining, will breathe all of this air, will stand in all of these cities, and will change every one of them and the world they made together forever. But that story begins slowly, with a kingdom in the mountains and a king who was building something for his son. There is no rush. The ancient world stretches out around us, wide and breathing in the dark, and we have all the time in the quiet night to find our way into it. Let the sound of that Mediterranean water carry you now, gently, towards sleep. The waves barely moving in the dark, the oil lamp guttering low. Rest here, at the edge of a great story, and let everything grow still. The wind comes down from the mountains before dawn, sliding off the shoulders of Olympus and threading through the pine forests of Macedon, carrying with it the cold smell of stone and snowmelt, and the faint sweetness of resin from trees that have stood on these slopes for longer than any man can remember. It arrives in the valleys below as something between a sigh and a whisper, stirring the long grass at the edges of the fields, lifting the smoke from the first morning fires, and passing through the open doorways of the low stone houses, where people are only just beginning to stir beneath their heavy wool blankets. This is the kingdom that made Alexander. Not the golden cities he would one day capture, not the vast Persian plains, not the sun-hammered deserts of the east, but these cold valleys, these forested ridges, this wind that smells of pine resin and distance, and something older than civilization itself. Macedon in the 4th century before the birth of Christ was not, it must be said, a place that the Greeks of the south regarded with much admiration. The Athenians, who prided themselves on their philosophy and their theater and the elegant colonnades of their city, tended to look northward toward Macedon with a mixture of suspicion and mild contempt. They considered the Macedonians semi-barbarians at best, people who spoke a rough dialect that sometimes barely resembled proper Greek, who drank their wine unmixed with water in a manner the Athenians found both alarming and vulgar, who settled disputes with a directness that had little room for the refined art of rhetoric. And yet this rugged, unfashionable kingdom, pressed between the sea to the south and the wild mountains to the north and west, would within a single generation reach out and reshape the known world entirely. The land itself had a quality of severity to it, a beauty that demanded something from those who lived within it rather than simply offering itself up for admiration. The mountains of Upper Macedon rose steeply and without apology, their flanks covered in forests of oak and beech and pine, their upper reaches bare and rocky, and swept by winds that made the eyes water and the cloak pulled tight around the body. Lower Macedon, where the rivers broadened and slowed into fertile plains, was gentler but still purposeful. Good land for grain and horses, land that rewarded hard work and punished idleness. The rivers ran cold and clear from their mountain sources, cutting through limestone gorges before spreading out across the lowland plains, and in the mornings before the sun had climbed above the ridgeline, they steamed softly in the cool air, their surfaces catching the first pale light like hammered silver. The people who lived in this landscape had been shaped by it in ways both physical and temperamental. Macedonian men were, by reputation and by the evidence of the battles they fought, exceptionally tough, accustomed to long marches over difficult ground, to sleeping in the open in all weather, to a diet that was plain and sufficient rather than refined and elaborate. They hunted the forests of their hills for boar and deer and bear, and the hunt was not merely a pastime, but a kind of education, a way of learning to move carefully through difficult terrain, to read the signs left by a living creature, to wait patiently, and then act with complete decisiveness when the moment arrived. It is said that a Macedonian man was not permitted to recline at the full feast, that particular honor of relaxed dining that Greeks elsewhere took for granted, until he had killed a boar without the use of a net. The stories suggest that young men of the court wore a rope around their waist, in place of the more honorable belt, until they had proven themselves in this way. And while the precise truth of this custom is difficult to confirm across so many centuries, it speaks clearly enough to the values of the culture, that status must be earned through demonstrated courage, that softness was a thing to be grown out of, rather than settled into. The court of Macedon at Pella, which was the capital city by the time Alexander was born, was a fascinating and somewhat turbulent mixture of the rough and the aspiring. Philip II, Alexander's father, had worked with extraordinary energy to transform Macedon from a fragmented, frequently invaded kingdom into a genuine power, and part of that transformation involved bringing into the court the cultural refinements that Greece further south had to offer. There were poets and philosophers at Pella, invited there by Philip, mingling in the great hall with men who had mud on their boots from the morning's hunting, and wine in their blood from the previous night's feast. The hall itself was large and smoky, its walls hung with the skins of hunted animals and the captured weapons of defeated enemies, its long tables lit at night by oil lamps and the central fire that burned in the hearth and sent its slow, fragrant smoke up toward the high rafters. It was not an Athenian symposium with its carefully modulated discourse. It was louder, rawer, more likely to end in a quarrel or a wrestling match than a considered philosophical conclusion, and yet the ambition to be something more than merely fierce was always present, threading through the smoke and the shouted toasts like that mountain wind threading through the pine trees, persistent, cool, impossible to entirely ignore. Philip himself was a remarkable figure to grow up beside. and the prince who would become Alexander grew up in his considerable shadow. Philip was a man of fierce intelligence and enormous physical presence, despite, or perhaps because of, the injuries he had accumulated through years of battle. He had lost sight in one eye to an arrow at the siege of Macedon, it is recorded, and walked with the particular purposeful gait of a man who has been damaged and has decided that the damage is simply part of what he is now. Drank heavily, as was the Macedonian custom at court, and his court was not a quiet or a peaceful place. There were factions and rivalries among the noble families, the companions, the hetairoi, who formed both the king's inner circle of friends and the elite cavalry of his army, each family ambitious, each man watching the others, alliances forming and shifting, with the slow inevitability of weather systems building over the mountains. A child growing up in this environment learned to read rooms, to understand the currents of loyalty and resentment that moved beneath the surface of even the most ordinary feast, to know who was in favor and who was not, and why those things mattered in ways that could be, at the extreme end, a question of survival. The women of the Macedonian court moved through this world with a particular kind of strength. Olympias, Alexander's mother, was by any account a formidable presence, a princess from Epirus to the west, deeply religious in the ecstatic traditions of her homeland, said to keep sacred snakes in the house and to participate with great intensity in the rites of Dionysus. She was fiercely devoted to her son in the way that certain kinds of love become indistinguishable from ambition, and her influence on the young Alexander was profound and complicated in ways that neither of them could perhaps fully have articulated. She told him, the stories say, that his true father was not Philip at all, but something greater, something divine. And whether she believed this entirely or partly, or told it to him as a kind of gift she was giving his future, no one who was there left any certain record. The pine smoke drifted through the hall at Pella on winter evenings, and outside the wind moved through the trees on the hillside above the city, and inside there was the sound of voices raised in argument or laughter or the half-sung words of a drinking song. And a boy sat in all of this and took it in, the roughness and the ambition together, the smell of wood smoke and roasting meat, and the animal closeness of men who lived their lives outdoors, and also the strange bright thread of learning and aspiration that ran through it, the presence of books and ideas, and the distant shimmer of a wider world that his father was even then in the process of reaching out to grasp. All of this, the cold mountain wind, the smoky hall, the competing voices of rough soldiers and imported scholars, the fierce attention of his mother, and the overwhelming example of his father, was the soil in which the boy grew. It was not gentle soil, and it did not produce a gentle flowering, but it produced something extraordinary, something that had never quite existed before and would never quite exist again. For now, though, that story is only just beginning, and the boy who will carry it forward is still very young, still learning to ride and to read and to listen to the wind come down off the mountain in the early morning, carrying its cold, clean smell of pine resin and stone and all the distance of the world. Rest now with the scent of pine smoke settling slowly through the rafters, and let the wind move through the trees outside, soft and unhurried, all through the long, dark mountain night. Somewhere in the highlands of Macedon, in the long, gold-dusted weeks of late summer, a child came into the world. The year was, by the reckoning we use now, 356 years before the birth of Christ, and the air over Pella, that sprawling, ambitious capital the Macedonian kings had built on the edge of a great marshy lake, would have been heavy with heat, with the smell of dried grass and river mud, with the low humming of insects moving through the reeds at the water's edge. It is the kind of air that makes time feel slow and plentiful, the kind that settles over a place and asks nothing of anyone. And into that air, on what the ancient sources suggest was around the 6th day of the month the Macedonians called Luce, Olympias, queen and wife of Philip II, held a new son against her chest and breathed. His name, settled upon him in the way of royal children with the full weight of dynastic intention, was Alexander. It was not a new name in his family. There had been Alexanders before him, in the long bloodline of the Argads, the ancient royal house of Macedon, and the name carried within it the old Greek meaning, something close to defender of men, or one who protects, which is the kind of name a king gives a son when he is already imagining what that son might become. Naming in that world was a kind of dreaming, a gentle act of ambition pressed into sound. The stories that gathered around his birth, as stories tend to gather around the births of those who later become legendary, are numerous and strange and beautiful in the way that legends always are. It is said that on the very night Alexander was born, the great temple of Artemis at Ephesus, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, and a building so magnificent that travelers came from every corner of the known world simply to stand before it, burned to the ground. The story goes that when those who guarded the temple were asked why they had not prevented the fire, they said they had been too busy attending to the birth of one who would himself one day shake the world. Whether this is true, or merely the kind of tale that forms around remarkable people, like morning mist forms around hills, it carries within it a quality of feeling, the sense that even the world seemed to register the arrival of something extraordinary. The torch, whether real or invented, had been lit somewhere, and the warmth of it would travel a very long way. His father Philip was not in Pella when the boy was born. Philip was almost always somewhere else, which was simply the nature of the man, a king who could not sit still, who was always moving, always pushing at the edges of what his kingdom was and what it might become. On that particular day, the ancient sources tell us, he was receiving news of 3 separate victories. A general of his had won a battle, his horses had won a race at the Olympic Games, and a son had been born to him at home. 3 pieces of good fortune in a single day, and Philip, who was a man who understood the language of omens as clearly as he understood the language of war, must have felt the day settle over him like something precious. But the father would return, as fathers do, and slowly the household around young Alexander would take on its particular shape, loud and complicated and full of competing currents, as royal households tend to be. Olympias, his mother, was not a Macedonian by birth. She had come from the kingdom of Epirus, a wild and mountainous land to the west, and she was a woman of considerable force and spiritual intensity. It is said that she practiced the ancient ecstatic rites of Dionysus with a fervor that unnerved even those accustomed to religious devotion, that she kept sacred serpents and handled them without fear, that she believed herself descended from Achilles and from the ancient heroes of the Greek world. Whether she communicated this sense of divine ancestry to her son directly, or simply by the atmosphere she created around herself, Alexander grew up in the company of myth, breathing it in like smoke, the way a child raised near the sea grows up knowing the smell of salt water without ever having been told what it is. From very early childhood, Alexander was placed in the care of a nurse named Lanike, who was gentle with him and whom he remembered fondly all his life. And he was also placed under the supervision of a man named Leonidas, a relative of Olympias, who served as his first tutor in the traditional Macedonian mode. Leonidas was strict in the way that those who believe hardship builds character are strict, rigorous about diet, demanding about physical training, suspicious of luxury. The story goes that he would sometimes go through the boy's baggage before journeys to make sure Olympias had not secretly packed anything too comfortable, too soft, too indulgent. He believed that a future king should eat simply and sleep without excess, that a child who ran and climbed and went somewhat hungry in the mornings would become a man who could endure anything. Philip approved of this approach. Philip was, above all things, a practical man. And yet the world that surrounded young Alexander was not austere in every corner. The court at Pella had grown, under Philip's careful and ambitious stewardship, into something genuinely impressive, a place where artists and thinkers came, where poets were welcomed, where the art on the walls was as fine as anything in Athens or Corinth. The palace was built of stone and timber, with painted floors and columns, and when the light came through its windows in the late afternoon, it fell in long, warm rectangles across the painted tiles, and the smell of the place would have been oil and stone and cedar wood, and occasionally the distant drift of something savory from the kitchens, and somewhere nearby always the sound of soldiers, footsteps, voices, the dull percussion of practice in the courtyards. Soldiers were simply part of the air of Pella. They were everywhere in Alexander's childhood, the way merchants are everywhere in a trading city, or musicians in a city that loves music. He grew up knowing the shape of armor, the smell of horses and leather and iron, the way men who have fought together move around one another, the particular quality of silence before a decision is made. He absorbed these things without being taught them, the way children always absorb the true texture of their world, not through instruction, but through presence, through the simple fact of being there, eyes open, taking it all in. He was also, from a very young age, fearless around horses. There is a famous story, which we will come to gently in its own time, about a great black horse and a moment of understanding between boy and animal that astonished even Philip himself. But that story belongs to a slightly later chapter of the boy's growing. For now it is enough to know that horses were part of his world, that the sound of them, the breathing, the slow percussion of hooves on packed earth, was as familiar to him as his own heartbeat. And Philip was there too when he was there, which was a complicated gift. A father who is also a king is a particular kind of presence, large and consequential, and not entirely available. Philip was proud of the boy, that much is clear from the record. He is said to have watched Alexander with something that went beyond ordinary paternal warmth, a kind of sharpened attention, an awareness that this son might become something. But he was also a man who was always half somewhere else in his mind, always calculating, always planning, always reaching for the next thing Macedon might become, and so the boy grew in the space between his mother's fierce mythological certainty and his father's restless practical ambition, between the sacred serpents and the battle reports, between the smell of incense and the smell of horses. He grew in the long, warm days of a highland kingdom that was still figuring out what it was, in a palace that looked out over a marshy lake where the light changed all afternoon, where the reeds moved in the wind, where the water held the reflection of the sky like a second sky lying beneath the first. He grew, and the world waited, and in not many years' time there would come to Macedon a philosopher, an extraordinary one, carrying within him the accumulated learning of the ancient Greek world, and he would meet this boy in a garden, and the meeting would change them both. But that is for the next soft stretch of the night, when you are perhaps already beginning to drift, your breath slowing, the day loosening its hold. For now, let the reeds at the edge of the lake be enough, their gentle, unhurried movement in the Macedonian dark, the water holding its quiet light. There is a place in the memory of the ancient world, a place the old writers return to again and again, with something very close to tenderness. A garden somewhere in the Macedonian countryside, near a village called Mieza, where the plane trees grew broad and generous, spreading their pale-barked arms across the paths, so that even on the longest summer afternoons, the shade was deep and cool, and smelled of green water and turned earth. It is the kind of place that seems, when you close your eyes and listen for it, as though it might still exist somewhere just beneath the ordinary world, tucked away between a hillside and a stream, holding its quiet like a cupped hand holds rain. It was to this place, sometime around the year 343 before the birth of Christ, that a boy of 13 years came to learn. His name, of course, was Alexander, and the man who waited for him there, sitting perhaps among scrolls or walking slowly along those shaded paths, with his hands folded behind his back, was a philosopher from the city of Stagira named Aristotle, a man whom later centuries would come to call simply the teacher, as though no further description were needed, as though the word itself bent toward him the way water bends toward low ground. Philip of Macedon, Alexander's father, had made the arrangement himself, and it is said he did so with unusual care, more care perhaps than he gave to many of his military campaigns. Philip understood soldiers. He understood horses and sieges and the leverage of alliances. But he seemed to understand, too, that his son was something that required a different kind of cultivation, something rarer and more delicate than a general. And so he reached for the finest mind available in all the Greek-speaking world, and said in the blunt way of Macedonian kings, essentially, teach him. Aristotle was perhaps 40 years old at the time, a former student of Plato's, a man who had already begun the extraordinary project of thinking carefully and systematically about nearly everything, about animals and stars and rhetoric and ethics and the nature of the soul and the best way for human beings to live together in cities. He had a methodical, observational quality of mind that was different from Plato's, less inclined toward the soaring and the abstract, more inclined to crouch down and look closely at what was actually there. He noticed things. He catalogued them. He held the world up to the light slowly, turning it, asking what it was made of. What the two of them, the restless golden-haired prince and the quiet, precise philosopher, made of each other during those years in Mieza, we cannot know entirely. The ancient sources gesture at their relationship with admiration and sometimes with a kind of wistfulness, as though even those writers, looking back across centuries, felt the particular atmosphere of that garden school as something that could not quite be reconstructed. Alexander himself is said to have spoken of Aristotle with great warmth, saying once that he owed his father life, but owed his teacher living, meaning perhaps that Aristotle had given him the inner instruments that made a life worth having. They studied medicine together, and it is said Alexander developed a genuine and lasting interest in healing, in the workings of the body, something that would express itself years later when he tended personally to his sick and wounded soldiers in the field. They studied mathematics and music. They read Homer together, above all, the Iliad, that long bronze-bright poem about war and pride and the terrible costs of glory, and Alexander loved it with a love that never diminished, sleeping later in his campaigns, the story goes, with a copy of it beneath his pillow alongside a dagger, as though both were equally necessary against the dark. They studied philosophy, the question of how a person ought to live, what virtues a leader ought to cultivate, what it means to be just, what it means to be courageous in a way that is not merely recklessness. Aristotle wrote for Alexander, or at least revised for him, a text on kingship and the nature of colonies, perhaps imagining even then the vast possibilities that lay ahead of his unusual student. The philosopher seemed to believe, in the way of his age, that Greek civilization was the highest form of human culture, and it is likely he passed something of this belief to Alexander, though Alexander, when he finally met the Persians and the Egyptians and the peoples of the Eastern world, would encounter a complexity that perhaps no Macedonian garden school could quite have prepared him for. But that is far ahead. For now, rest with the garden. The other boys who came to study at Mieza with Alexander have not entirely faded from history. Some of them would become his generals, his companions, his most trusted friends, men like Hydaspes, whose closeness to Alexander would become one of the most remarked-upon relationships of the ancient world, a friendship of such depth and constancy that some ancient writers spoke of them as a single thing, two halves of one remarkable life. These boys sat together in the shade, listening, arguing, perhaps laughing when Aristotle turned his back, scuffing at the path with their sandals, and growing slowly, without entirely realizing it, into the men who would help reshape the known world. The lessons at Mieza were not always formal, or at least one imagines they were not. Aristotle was a thinker who believed in walking while thinking, in letting the body move while the mind worked, and so the paths of that garden must have been well worn beneath their feet, those feet moving slowly back and forth while the older man talked about the nature of justice, or the classification of fish, or the way the stars moved in their slow, enormous arcs above the mountains of Macedon. There is something in this image, the walking, the talking, the trees overhead, the smell of damp stone and evening air, that feels restful even now, even at this great distance, as though the rhythm of those footsteps has somehow preserved itself in the silence. It is said that Aristotle gave Alexander a copy of the Iliad that he had personally annotated, corrected, and prepared for the prince's particular use. Whether this is literally true, or whether it has the quality of a story that felt true to those who told it, we cannot be certain. But it carries something real about the relationship, the idea that Aristotle offered Alexander not only general wisdom, but something personally curated, shaped for the particular shape of his mind. Alexander spent perhaps 3 years at Mieza, perhaps a little more, before the pressures of his father's world began pulling him back toward the court at Pella, toward horses and armies and the complicated machinery of a kingdom that was always on the edge of war, or the edge of alliance, or the edge of both at once. He would not return to that garden. He would carry it with him instead, in whatever form such things can be carried, in habits of mind, in questions he had learned to ask, in books he kept close during the long, hard years of campaign. His relationship with Aristotle did not end warmly, in the end. By the time Alexander was deep in his campaigns in the East, something had shifted. There were tensions, political suspicions. The execution of a young man named Callisthenes, who was Aristotle's nephew or grandnephew, and who had made the mistake of publicly criticizing Alexander's increasingly Persian-inflected style of kingship. After that, the warmth cooled, and the two men, the student and the sage, seemed to have kept a cautious, perhaps sorrowful distance. But that is later. Much later. That belongs to another night. For now, let the garden at Mieza be what it was in those early years, a place of plane trees and slow walking, of a boy learning to think about the world before he changed it. of a philosopher patient enough to believe that the right questions, asked carefully in the right kind of shade, might make a difference. The air in that garden in the evening would have carried the smell of the mountains, pine resin and cold stone, and the faint, sweet darkness of the Macedonian hills at dusk. That same air that moved down through the valleys and across the plain, the same air that found its way through the open windows of every lamplit house in the kingdom below, bending the small flames gently, briefly, as though to remind them that the world outside was very large and very quiet, and that the night, as always, was kind enough to ask nothing of anyone at all. Sleep if you can, with that garden still in mind. Tomorrow's night belongs to the young men of Macedon themselves, to the ordinary textured world they lived in, to the smell of their bread and the sound of their markets and the weight of bronze in their hands. The morning comes slowly to a Macedonian village, arriving first not as light but as sound. The low, patient lowing of oxen somewhere beyond the timber walls, the creak of a wooden gate swung open by a farmer whose grandfather and great-grandfather swung that same gate open at this same hour, in this same gray half-darkness before the sun has cleared the ridgeline to the east. The air at this hour carries the cold down from the mountains like a gift no one asked for, threading through the smoke holes in the rooftops and settling along the ground where dogs are still curled into themselves, reluctant to admit that the night is finished. There is wood smoke already rising from a dozen hearths, and the smell of it mingles with damp earth and the faint sweetness of last autumn's grain, still stored in clay jars, pressed against the inner walls, sealed with wax and patience, waiting out the winter. This is Macedon in the 4th century before the birth of Christ, and it is a place of textures before it is a place of ideas. Rough wool against rough skin, mud that holds the shape of a sandal long after the foot has moved on, limestone outcroppings that catch the afternoon light and hold it like memory. The Greeks to the south, in their more refined city-states, sometimes spoke of Macedonians with a certain quiet condescension, as if the mountain air had kept them somehow older, less polished, closer to an earlier way of being in the world. And perhaps there was something to that, though not in the way the Athenians intended it, for Macedon had a kind of unhurried solidity to it, a weight, a rootedness in the physical world that no amount of philosophical refinement could quite replicate. The villages are not large, a cluster of stone and timber houses set along the curve of a hillside, oriented not by any grand civic plan, but simply by the practical logic of water and wind and where the soil lies deepest. The houses themselves are low and thick-walled, their roofs pitched steeply enough to shed the heavy winter snow that comes without apology each year from the mountains of the interior. Inside, the main room is everything at once, kitchen and sleeping space, and shelter for the youngest animals in the coldest months, all of it gathered around the central hearth, where a fire of olive wood or oak burns with a steady amber glow that gives the room its only light and its primary warmth and its faint, constant, beloved smell. The hearth is the heart of a Macedonian home in a way that is almost impossible to overstate. It is where bread is baked on flat stones pushed close to the embers, where the clay pot of barley porridge or lentil stew rests through the long morning hours, slowly thickening and deepening in flavor, until it is ready to be ladled into earthenware bowls at midday. The bread itself is dense and slightly sour, made from emmer wheat or barley flour mixed with water and a small piece of yesterday's dough, kept aside specifically for this purpose. Generation after generation of starters, passed down like inheritance. It emerges from the heat slightly charred along one edge, always, and the people who eat it do not consider this a flaw. Beyond the villages, the land opens into fields of surprising generosity, given the ruggedness of the terrain. Wheat and barley grow in the lower valleys, where the rivers have left rich dark soil. Olive trees, ancient and knotted, stand in groves along the southern-facing slopes, their silver-green leaves turning and turning in the slightest breeze. And in the autumn, these trees produce the oil that goes into almost everything, rubbed onto skin after bathing, poured over bread, used to preserve food, burned in the small clay lamps that sit on ledges and windowsills and fill the evenings with their warm, wavering light. The smell of olive oil warming over a flame is so ordinary in Macedon that no one remarks upon it. It is simply the smell of being alive and indoors, the smell of evening. There are vineyards too, terraced carefully into hillsides by hands that understood the labor of stonework. And the wine that comes from them is thick and dark and intensely flavored, meant to be mixed with water in the traditional way, though the story goes that Macedonian men were sometimes inclined to drink it less diluted than their southern neighbors would have found strictly respectable. The Greeks of Athens and Corinth had a certain ritual decorum around wine drinking. The symposium, with its rules and its measured cups and its careful conversation. In Macedon, drinking was a rather more robust affair, especially at the court of the king, where the great feasting hall could hold dozens of men around long tables, and where the wine flowed in rough bronze cups and the talk grew loud enough to reach the ceiling beams and roll back down again. Bronze is everywhere in this world. It edges the shields stacked in the corner of a farmer's home. It makes the blades of the short daggers worn tucked into belts. It forms the rim of the shallow drinking bowls passed hand to hand at a feast, and it catches the firelight and throws it back in warm, ruddy flickers that make every face look a little more weathered, a little more alive. Iron is becoming more common, it is true. The blacksmith at the edge of most larger settlements works iron into tools and weapons with increasing skill. But bronze still carries a kind of ceremonial weight, an association with things that matter, with the serious business of war and the serious pleasure of celebration. The women of Macedonian households move through their mornings with the particular efficiency of people who have always worked and expect to go on working. There is bread to make and wool to card and spin into thread, and thread to weave on the upright looms that stand in better lit corners, their rhythmic clacking, a kind of quiet percussion underlying all the other sounds of the morning. The wool comes from the sheep that graze on the high meadows in summer and are brought down to the valley pastures before the first snow, and it is spun into cloth that is neither delicate nor fine, but is extraordinarily warm and durable, and smells, even after washing, faintly of the animal it came from and the herbs it was dried among. Women of wealthier households might have access to linen, and the wives of nobles and officers sometimes wore garments dyed with the expensive colors, deep saffron yellow, rich terracotta red, that signaled a certain standing in the world, though even these were never as elaborate as what one might find in the great Persian court that lay, at this point in the story, still very far to the east, and not yet anything more than a rumor. The children of Macedon grow up outdoors in a way that leaves marks on them that never quite fade. They learn to ride early, most of them, because horses are a central and celebrated part of Macedonian culture in a way that sets the kingdom apart from many of its neighbors. The Macedonian cavalry, which will one day reshape the warfare of the known world, is rooted in something as simple as the fact that boys here learn to sit a horse before they have learned very many other things, that the relationship between a rider and an animal is taught as a kind of first language, wordless and physical and deep. There are boys in these villages right now in the early years of the 4th century before Christ who are learning to balance bareback on ponies, who are falling off and getting back on, who are developing a kind of instinctive understanding of how a large animal moves and thinks and can be guided with the knees and the weight of the body. And all of this ordinary childhood education will one day be poured into the thunderous, decisive charges that reshape the world. In the late afternoon, when the light turns golden and the shadows of the olive trees lengthen across the hillside pastures, and the last of the day's work is being folded away or set aside or simply left until morning, there is a particular quality of peace that settles over a Macedonian village. Smoke rises from every hearth again. The smell of bread and stew and wood fire and animal warmth drifts out through open doorways. The mountains to the north and west are blue-gray in the declining light, immovable and ancient, and they make everything at their feet look appropriately small and temporary and rather beautiful for it. It is into this world, these smells, these textures, these rhythms, that a particular child is growing up at the court in Pella, surrounded by soldiers and philosophers and the complicated love of a complicated father. The world of the village and the world of the palace are not as far apart as they might seem. They share the same mountains, the same bronze, the same firelight, the same oil burning low in the lamp at the end of the day. And soon that child will begin to step into something larger, to take his first real steps out of the warm domestic world and into the shark serious realm of war. But that is a story for another evening, and there is no need to hurry toward it now. The lamp burns quietly, the fire settles, the mountains are patient, and so can you be, resting here in the dark, letting the old world go gently dim around you. The summer dust of Macedon settles slowly in the long afternoon light, drifting down through the dry mountain air like something the hills have exhaled after a season of heat, coating the leaves of the olive trees silver gray, lying soft on the roads that wind between the low stone walls of the countryside. It is the kind of afternoon that asks nothing of anyone, that invites the body to grow heavy and the mind to loosen its grip on the world. And yet somewhere on those dusty roads, a young man is learning what it means to lead. He is perhaps 16 years old, this prince of Macedon, and his father has given him something remarkable. Not simply a sword or a horse or a title, but responsibility. Real responsibility, the kind that has weight to it, the kind that presses down on the shoulders and asks you to carry it without flinching. Philip II, king of all Macedon, soldier and diplomat, and tireless architect of empire, has left his son behind as regent while he leads the army east on campaign. And in doing so, he has handed the boy the machinery of a kingdom and said, quietly, "Run it." It is said that Alexander did not disappoint. The court at Pella, that great sprawling palace above the plain, continued its slow daily rhythms under his watch. The correspondence arriving and departing, the petitions heard, the decisions made, with a steadiness that surprised even those courtiers who had watched him grow from an infant, who had seen him as a small, fierce child chasing the palace dogs through the colonnaded halls. There was something in him already that drew people to stillness, a quality of attention, of being completely present in the moment, that made those around him feel both seen and settled. The lamplight in the great hall would fall across his face as he listened to some dispute, or read some dispatch from the east, and the light caught the pale angles of his features and made him look, the older men sometimes thought, like something that did not quite belong to ordinary time. But regency, however well managed, is not the thing itself. The thing itself is the field. And Philip knew this, and when his son had shown himself capable of governance, the next lesson was the one that mattered most in that rough martial world, the lesson of command under fire. Alexander's first real military action came early, before Chaeronea, before the great battles that would define him. He rode with his father's cavalry on the northern campaigns, into the wild hill country where the tribes of Thrace pressed against Macedon's borders, where the landscape was nothing like the cultivated plains of Greece, but something older and harder, a place of dense forest and narrow passes and rivers running cold and gray from the high ground. They were grown men who had been fighting since before Alexander could walk, men with scarred hands and crooked noses and eyes that had seen things the young prince could only imagine. And yet he rode with them, and he learned from them, not by asking to be taught, but simply by watching and absorbing and being there, in the dust and the cold river crossings and the long nights under the stars, with the horses restless and the fire burning low. There is a campaign, recorded in the histories with some uncertainty as to its precise details, in which Alexander led a force against a tribe called the Mede, who had risen in rebellion against Macedonian authority during Philip's absence. He is said to have handled it with a confidence that belied his age, moving the troops with a decisiveness that older commanders might have envied, capturing the tribe's main settlement and founding there a small garrison town which, the story goes, he named Alexandropolis after himself. Because even then, even at 16, he was aware of the weight of his own name and the importance of marking the places where he had been. It is a small detail, a young man's vanity perhaps, or perhaps something else, something closer to an instinct for legacy, for the understanding that a life must leave traces in the world if it is to mean anything beyond itself. But it is the year 338 before the birth of Christ, the summer of Chaeronea, that places the young Alexander fully into the light of history. And so we drift there now, slowly, following the road south through the passes of central Greece, where the air smells of pine resin and wild thyme, and the dust rises in pale clouds behind a marching army. Chaeronea is a city in Boeotia, in the heartland of old Greece, and it sits on a plain that the ancients knew well as a place where armies gathered and histories turned. Philip had been maneuvering for years, patiently and brilliantly, to bring the Greek city-states under his influence, and now the great coalition of Athens and Thebes had finally decided to stop him by force. They faced him across that plain, the Athenian soldiers on one wing, the Thebans on the other, with their famous sacred band at the strongest point of the line, those 300 paired warriors who had never been broken in battle, and who stood now in the morning light with a stillness that comes from absolute certainty in one's own ability. Philip commanded the right wing of the Macedonian army himself. Alexander commanded the left, the cavalry, with a group of senior officers around him who had been instructed, one imagines, to guide without overshadowing, to advise without undermining. He was 18 years old. The plain would have been brilliant in the early light, the dew still on the long grass, the mountains around the edges of the world still faintly purple with the last of the night. The battle, when it came, was not simply a matter of strength against strength. Philip, the great tactician, feigned a retreat on the right, pulling his infantry slowly backward in a controlled withdrawal that was designed to look like panic, but was in fact the most precise and demanding maneuver an infantry line can execute. The Athenians, seeing the Macedonians falling back, broke formation and surged forward, crying out in their certainty of victory, opening a gap in their own line as they did so, losing the careful shape that had made them safe. And into that gap Alexander moved. He led the cavalry through the opening, through the wheeling, dusty chaos of the battlefield, and drove hard into the flank of the sacred band of Thebes. What followed was one of the most complete destructions of a celebrated fighting force in all of ancient military history. The sacred band, those 300 men who had never broken, were encircled, and they were killed almost to the last. It is said that Philip himself walked over the field after the battle and wept when he saw them, those dead warriors lying in orderly ranks as they had stood in life, still facing the enemy, unwilling even in death to turn away. He is said to have called them the finest men he had ever faced, and his son had destroyed them. Alexander did not weep, or if he did, history does not record it. What history records is the shape of the thing he had done, the cavalry charge through the gap, the encirclement, the completeness of the victory on his wing. He was 18 years old, and he had just demonstrated to the assembled world of Greece and Macedon that whatever gift his father possessed for war, the son possessed it too, perhaps in a form that was already in some ways pure and more instinctive. The army camped that night on the plain, and the torches and the fires would have been lit across the field as the long golden dusk settled over Boeotia, the smoke rising slowly into the cooling air, the soldiers attending to their wounds and their horses and their exhaustion. Somewhere among the fires, Alexander would have sat with his companions, those young men who were growing into his circle, his close guard, his friends, men who had ridden beside him through the dust and the horror of the afternoon and come through it to the other side, to this quiet, smoky, extraordinary evening. He would have looked at the fires, perhaps, the way young men do when they have just done something for the first time that they will spend the rest of their lives doing, with a kind of wondering recognition, as though the fire were showing him the shape of what he was becoming. And the world, that wide ancient world of olive trees and mountain roads and slow-moving rivers, would have been very still around him, as it is still now in the quietness of this moment, as you let the day go and breathe slowly and rest, knowing that the story continues tomorrow, into the darker places that follow every great triumph, the things a young man must face when the battle is won, and the king his father is no longer beside him. The torches were already burning by the time the procession began. It was the sort of morning that asks nothing of you, a pale and quiet morning in the early Macedonian summer, the hills around Aegae still holding the last cool breath of night, the grasses along the road silvered with dew, the air carrying that particular stillness that comes before a great gathering of people, before the noise of a festival crowd fills the spaces between things. The city of Aegae, the old royal seat, the sacred place, the city where Macedonian kings had always been buried and where their gods still felt close, had been dressed for celebration with garlands and offerings, and the smell of roasting meat drifting up from fires lit since before dawn, mixing with the sweetness of pine resin and the dusty mineral smell of old stone warmed slowly by a rising sun. The occasion was magnificent, or was meant to be magnificent, and it is worth letting yourself imagine the scale of it as you settle now into your pillow, closing your eyes against the ordinary darkness of wherever you are, and drifting back through more than 2,000 years to stand at the edge of that crowd. Philip II, King of Macedon, was celebrating. He had much to celebrate, and he knew it, and he was not the sort of man who let such moments pass without theater. His daughter Cleopatra, not the famous Cleopatra of Egypt, but a Macedonian princess, his own child, was to be married that morning to Alexander of Epirus, her uncle, a political alliance woven carefully and expensively over years of negotiation. And more than the wedding, Philip was celebrating the very shape of his life's work, the thing he had spent 30 years hammering into existence with his own hands and his own will and the blood of his soldiers. He had unified Greece, or unified it as much as Greece had ever permitted itself to be unified, which is to say, imperfectly and under considerable protest. And he stood now at the threshold of his greatest ambition, a campaign against Persia, against the ancient empire that had twice invaded Greece, that had burned Athens and humiliated the Greek world, and which now seemed ripe, finally, for an answer. Philip at 46, 406 years before the birth of Christ, if the traditional reckoning holds, was not the clean, idealized figure of later monuments. He had lived hard. He walked with a limp from a wound taken in battle years before. He had lost the sight of one eye to an arrow at the siege of Macedon, and the story goes that he wore that damage the way he wore everything else that life had thrown at him, as evidence that he had survived, that he was still here, still moving, still building. He was a man of enormous physical energy and enormous political intelligence, a drinker, a diplomat, a soldier who understood both the blunt instrument of the phalanx and the quieter instruments of marriage and money and patience. He had made Macedon into the most powerful state in the Greek world, and his son, his remarkable, complicated, already difficult son Alexander, stood somewhere in that festive crowd that morning, watching. The procession through the theater of Aegae was a ceremonial entrance, the kind of formal public display that ancient kings used to remind their subjects and their foreign guests of just how much power looked like when it walked slowly through an open space. Philip was to enter the theater, accompanied by his bodyguard, but it is said that he had arranged, in a gesture of deliberate confidence, to enter with only a small escort, walking some paces ahead of his companions, presenting himself alone to the crowd, demonstrating that he feared nothing, that he was beloved, that a king of Macedon in his own kingdom, on a festival morning, had no need of shields pressed close against him. It was the kind of gesture that only a man who felt entirely secure could make, or perhaps the kind of gesture that only a man who had stopped being careful could make. His name was Pausanias. He was a young man of the royal bodyguard, one of the king's own companions, someone who by virtue of his position had stood close to Philip for years, who had eaten at his table and ridden on his campaigns, and who was by every visible measure a loyal and trusted member of the inner circle. What moved inside him on that morning, what constellation of grievances or humiliations or darker intentions had been assembling themselves in the quiet of his private thoughts, is something that the ancient sources argue over and that we can never entirely know. There are stories of a personal wrong done to him, of a complaint made to Philip that was dismissed or laughed at, of a wound to his pride that had never healed and had instead turned slowly into something colder and more purposeful. The historian Diodorus tells us one version of events, and other ancient writers offer their own variations, and none of them agree entirely, and perhaps the precise machinery of motive was as obscure to people then as it is to us now. What is certain, or as certain as anything can be across this depth of years, is what happened in the theater of Aegae on that summer morning. Pausanias, standing close enough to the procession to act, drew a short blade and drove it into the king. Philip II, conqueror of Greece, father of Alexander, architect of the world his son would inherit and transform beyond all recognition, died there in the theater of Aegae. It would have been fast, the way such things always are, a sudden rupture in the festival air, the crowd's festive noise becoming something else entirely in the space of a heartbeat. Some of the bodyguard gave chase immediately, and Pausanias was killed before he could escape, cut down before whatever he had intended next could unfold, before he could explain himself to anyone, or be brought to trial, or made to speak. The story goes that this swiftness of death struck some people at the time as suspicious, as though those who killed him had reasons of their own to ensure he did not speak, and the ancient world whispered for years afterward about who might have wanted Philip dead, and who might have arranged, or encouraged, or simply permitted what Pausanias had done. There were those who named Olympias, Alexander's mother, a woman of fierce and formidable temperament, who had long since been set aside by Philip in favor of a younger Macedonian wife. There were those who whispered Alexander's name itself. There were those who pointed toward Persia. None of it was ever resolved. None of it could be resolved. The only man who knew the whole of it was dead in the dust of the theater before the morning crowd had quite understood what it was watching. What remained, in the sudden silence after the noise, was the shape of a kingdom without its king. Alexander was 20 years old. He had been a military commander already, had governed Macedon in his father's absence, had fought at Chaeronea, had ridden and campaigned and studied, and been prepared for rule his entire conscious life. He was, by any measure, ready, or as ready as a young man of 20 can be for the immensity of what has just been placed in front of him. And yet readiness and inheritance are not the same thing, and what he inherited in that moment was not only Philip's power, but Philip's unfinished alliances, Philip's restless enemies, the Greek cities that had submitted to Macedonian dominance and were now calculating quickly whether Philip's death gave them a window to reclaim what they had lost. The northern tribes along Macedon's borders who respected Philip's iron hand and were already wondering how they felt about his son. The whole vast, trembling architecture of a hegemony that had been built on one man's specific personality and which now had to be rebuilt immediately around another. The wedding garlands were still on the walls of Aegae. The fires for the festival feast were still burning. The smell of pine and roasting meat and incense drifting through the old city would not yet have faded. And Alexander walked through all of it and began. How he moved through those first days, how swiftly and with what kind of cold clarity he turned to the work of securing what was his, is a story that belongs to the next quiet chapter of this long journey. A story of speed and determination and the consolidation of a kingdom before it could fall apart at the seams. Played out across the mountains and cities of a world still adjusting to the fact that the great king was gone, and that something new, something that would eventually prove stranger and larger than Philip had ever imagined, had just taken his place. For now, though, let the torches of Aegae burn down to their last warm inches, and let the festival crowd disperse slowly into the dark streets of the old city, and let the night settle over the mountains of Macedon the way it always does, quietly, without hurry, indifferent to the extraordinary things that happen beneath it. The fires had burned low across Macedon in the days after Philip's death, and now a different kind of stillness had settled over the land, not the stillness of peace, but the stillness of a world holding its breath, waiting to see what the young king would do next. Alexander was 20 years old, and the throne beneath him felt, to many in the wider world, like something that might yet be taken away. Word had traveled fast along the old roads and the dusty merchant paths that connected the Greek-speaking world, and what that word had stirred in certain corners was not grief, but something closer to hope. Hope that with Philip gone, the long arm of Macedonian authority might at last retract, might curl back into those northern mountains, and leave the proud city-states of Greece to breathe freely once more. In Thebes and Athens, in the hill towns and the harbor cities, men gathered in public squares and spoke in low, quickening voices about the possibilities that Philip's death had opened. The story goes that in Athens, the orator Demosthenes, who had spent so many years warning his fellow citizens about the dangers of Macedonian power, appeared in the assembly dressed in white, wearing garlands as though some personal celebration had found him, though we should hold that image gently, as it comes to us through voices not always friendly to his memory. Still, the mood was real. Across the Greek world, the bonds of the League of Corinth, which Philip had so carefully constructed to bind the city-states to Macedonian leadership, seemed suddenly to many like chains that a sharp breath might break. And in the north, beyond the borders of Macedon itself, other voices were stirring too. The Illyrian tribes, those fierce and independent peoples of the rugged western highlands, had long chafed under Macedonian pressure. The Tribalians and other peoples of Thrace, further east and north, where the land rolls away toward the great rivers, sensed in the transition of power a moment of opportunity. They had watched Philip consolidate his grip on the region for decades, and now they wondered whether his young son possessed anything like his father's iron resolve. The answer Alexander was preparing to give them would take the form not of words, but of movement, swift, exhausting, almost bewildering movement, the kind that covered hundreds of miles in weeks and left enemies uncertain whether they were dealing with a man or with some force of nature wearing a young man's face. Alexander began in the south. He moved his army down through Thessaly with a kind of quiet urgency, following the old paths through the mountain passes, where the autumn grasses bent in the cool wind that came off the higher slopes and carried with it the faint smell of pine resin and turned earth. The Thessalians had recognized Philip as their leader, and, when Alexander arrived among them, he did not arrive as a conqueror demanding renewed submission. He came, it is said, as a man who understood the value of making willing allies rather than resentful subjects. He spoke to them of shared heritage, of the bonds between Macedon and Thessaly that went back generations, and the Thessalians confirmed him as their leader with a warmth that perhaps surprised some who had expected resistance. From there he continued south, through the narrow pass of Thermopylae, that ancient throat of land between the mountains and the sea, where history had already pressed its fingers more than once, and down into the heartland of Greece. Athens, for all its whispered excitement at Philip's death, found itself face to face with a practical reality that cooled its enthusiasm considerably. Alexander arrived not with threats, but with something more disconcerting. A calm and confident presence, an apparent willingness to be reasonable, and an army positioned in such a way that unreasonableness would have been costly. He confirmed the terms of the League of Corinth. He was named as his father had been, the hegemon of the Greek states, the leader of the great campaign against Persia that Philip had been planning at the time of his death. Demosthenes and the other voices of Athenian resistance found themselves, at least for the moment, without the crisis they had hoped might give their arguments new force. The city did not rise. The opportunity, if it had ever truly existed, passed like smoke in the wind that came off the harbor and carried with it the salt smell of the Saronic Gulf. But it was in Thebes that the resistance came closest to crystallizing into something real, and Thebes would have to wait its turn, for Alexander first wheeled north again with a speed that even experienced soldiers found remarkable, because the northern frontiers needed his attention before he could afford to look south a second time. The campaign that followed through Thrace and up toward the great river that the Greeks called the Ister, and we know as the Danube, was a thing of hard marching and harder fighting through landscapes that felt very far from the warm marble cities of the south. These were lands of tall grass and wide sky, of river crossings made on improvised rafts and hollowed logs, of hillside ambushes in the gray morning light. The Triballians retreated before him toward the river, and Alexander pushed north all the way to the Danube's edge, a symbolic moment as much as a military one, for the river itself marked something like the edge of the Greek-speaking world. It is said he looked out across that wide, slow-moving water at the far bank and felt the pull of what lay beyond, though whether this is memory or embellishment, it is difficult now to say. He crossed briefly, it seems, simply to demonstrate that the river was no barrier to him, and then turned back to deal with the Illyrians pressing in from the west. Those western campaigns in the mountains were rougher and less certain, the kind of fighting where the enemy knew the ground and used it, where a column could be funneled into a narrow valley and find the slopes above it suddenly alive with movement. Alexander handled these difficulties with the kind of tactical ingenuity that would become his signature, adapting, reading the terrain, using the discipline and the particular fighting formation of the Macedonian phalanx in ways that kept his forces dangerous, even in compromised ground. The Illyrian chieftains were eventually driven back, their momentum broken, their confidence in the weakness of the new king thoroughly revised. And it was during these northern campaigns that the news arrived from the south. News that would require Alexander to move faster than perhaps even he had imagined possible. Thebes had risen. Word had reached the city, apparently through rumor or deliberate misinformation, that Alexander had been killed somewhere in the northern campaigns. Taking this as their moment, the Thebans had risen against the Macedonian garrison that had been stationed there since Philip's time, and called upon the rest of Greece to join them in throwing off the Macedonian yoke. Athens wavered. Others watched. What happened next still carries, in the telling of it, a quality of almost impossible speed. Alexander brought his army south through Thessaly and down through the passes in fewer days than seemed credible for a force of that size, covering something like 300 miles in roughly 2 weeks through difficult terrain, in such haste that the Thebans reportedly refused at first to believe the army appearing before their walls was his at all. Some insisted it must be a different Macedonian force, that Alexander was still far away in the north. By the time the truth was clear, the moment for organized resistance had already narrowed considerably. The fall of Thebes itself was swift and terrible in ways that Alexander's later life would sometimes suggest he regretted, though what a man regrets and what a man does are not always the same thing. The city was taken, its buildings pulled down, its population enslaved, all but the temples and the house of the poet Pindar, which Alexander ordered preserved, a detail that carries in it some sense of the complicated young man behind the military commander, someone who had grown up with poetry in his ears and philosophy in his mornings, and who could not quite bring himself to let that particular light go dark. The destruction was meant as a warning to the rest of Greece, and as a warning it was heard. Athens sent envoys. The resistance that had seemed about to coalesce dissolved instead into a careful, watchful quiet. The Greek world had looked at Alexander and decided, with the pragmatic wisdom that cities develop when they wish to survive, that the young king was neither a distraction nor an opportunity. He was something else entirely, something that perhaps none of them yet had quite the right word for. By the time the winter rains came, soft and gray over the hills of Macedon, pattering on the stones of the agora, and running in thin channels along the edges of the mountain roads, Alexander had secured what his father had built and made it for now his own. The kingdom was steady, the north was quiet, the south had gone still, and somewhere to the east, beyond the blue line of the Aegean where the wind came in cool and salt-edged off the water, a much larger world was waiting, ancient and vast and gilded with a wealth that Greek soldiers had been dreaming about for generations. The water was the first thing, always the water. The way it looked in the early morning before the sun had fully committed to the sky, gray and silver and breathing slowly, as though the sea itself were still half asleep, as though it had not yet decided what color it wished to be on this particular morning in the spring of 334 years before the birth of Christ. The Hellespont is a narrow thing as straits go. You can stand on the European shore and see the Asian coast without straining your eyes, can watch the grasses move on the far hills, can almost imagine you hear the birds over there, different birds, calling in a different air, and yet for all its narrowness it had always felt, to those who looked upon it, like something more than water. It felt like a border between worlds, between the known and the unknowable, between the land of home and the land of legend. The Persians had crossed it going west, long before Alexander was born, and Greece had shuddered. Now something was preparing to cross it going east, and the world, though it did not know it yet, was about to change its shape. The army had been assembling for weeks. It is said that Alexander brought with him somewhere near 37,000 soldiers, foot and cavalry together, a number that sounds large until you consider the empire they were preparing to enter, an empire that stretched from the Aegean to the borders of India, that held within it mountains and deserts, and rivers so wide you could not see across them, that had been ruled by the same dynasty for 2 centuries and more. Against all of that, 37,000 men was a very small flame to send into such a vast darkness. But Alexander had always trusted fire. The crossing was done in stages, the great fleet of boats and transport vessels going back and forth across the narrow gray water, soldiers standing in the hulls with their spears upright, the oars pulling steadily, the sound of the water against the wood a slow, patient rhythm beneath everything. It is said that Alexander himself steered one of the boats, taking the rudder with his own hands, wanting to feel the moment of passage as something personal, something deliberate, not merely a logistics problem to be solved, but a threshold to be crossed with full attention. And somewhere in the middle of the strait between Europe and Asia, he is said to have sacrificed to the gods of the sea, pouring libations into the water, watching the offerings drift and dissolve, the wine spreading in dark threads through the gray current, before disappearing entirely. And when his ship reached the Asian shore, the story goes, he was the first to leap out, fully armored, into the shallows, the water cold around his ankles, his greaves flashing in the early light. He drove his spear into the soil of Asia as he landed, a gesture of claiming, of declaring the continent already won, already spoken for, already his by right of courage and intention if not yet by fact. He stood there for a moment, the water pulling back around his seat, the spear vibrating slightly in the earth, and the continent received him without comment, as continents do. There were things to do before the fighting began, or rather there was one thing, ancient and important and not to be hurried. Not far from the landing place lay the ruins of Troy, or what was believed to be Troy in Alexander's time, the windswept mound and its scattered stones, the walls that had witnessed, or so the poet said, 10 years of terrible patience and grief, and the slow grinding of heroes against one another in the dust. Alexander had grown up on the Iliad. His mother, Olympias, had told him, it is said, that he was descended from Achilles on her side of the family, and he had carried the book with him, annotated by Aristotle himself, in a small casket beneath his bed. To come to this shore and not pay respects to Achilles would have been unthinkable. He went to the tomb, or what was said to be the tomb, and laid a wreath upon it. He ran naked around it, as was the ancient custom for honoring the heroic dead. His companion Hephaestion, who was as close to him as anyone in the world, laid a wreath upon the nearby tomb said to belong to Patroclus, Achilles' great friend. And something in that parallel gesture, the two young men honoring the two ancient companions, must have felt to those watching like a deliberate echo, a statement of identity, a declaration of who Alexander believed himself to be, and who he wished the world to understand him to be. The water glittered behind them as they made their way back to the army, the Hellespont still moving quietly in the morning light, indifferent to everything it had just allowed to pass. The Persians were not asleep. They knew the Macedonians had crossed, and the local satraps, the regional governors who administered Asia Minor, on behalf of the Persian king Darius III, had gathered an army to meet them. The place they chose was the Granicus River, a modest waterway that ran through the rolling landscape of northwest Asia Minor, its banks steep in places, the current quick and cold with the runoff of spring. It was a reasonable place to make a stand. The Persians positioned their cavalry along the far bank, where the slope would work against any attacker trying to cross, where the horses could wait above the waterline and come down on men struggling through the current. It was an afternoon battle, which was unusual. Alexander's general Parmenion, older and careful in the way that men who have survived many battles learn to be careful, counseled waiting until morning. The light was wrong. The crossing would be difficult. The Persian position was strong. All of these things were true, and Alexander listened to them, acknowledged them, and then crossed the river anyway. What followed was, by all accounts, a moment of tremendous violence and confusion. The shallows turning white, horses screaming, the clash of metal on metal and the particular sound, terrible and human, of men going down in cold water. The Macedonian cavalry hit the Persian line at an oblique angle, trying to draw attention and disruption while the infantry worked its way across further along, and for a time the outcome was not clear, the way outcomes never are clear when you are in the middle of them, when all you can see is the water and the horse beside you, and the blade coming toward your face. Alexander fought in the thick of it, as he always did. Always would, as though he believed that battles were won by the commander's body as much as by his plans. He was struck, it is said, on the helmet by a Persian nobleman named Spithridates, a blow hard enough to cut through the metal and graze his scalp, and another Persian officer was already raising a sword to finish what the first blow had started, when Alexander's companion Cletus the Black they called him, cut the man's arm from his body and saved the king's life. These things happen in battles, sudden and irreversible, and the world turns on them without pausing to observe what it has done. The Persians broke. Their cavalry, which had been their strength, became their confusion as the line collapsed, and the ground offered nowhere useful to retreat. The Greek mercenaries fighting in Persian service, and there were many thousands of them, Greeks fighting against Greeks for Persian gold, were surrounded on a hill and largely destroyed. It was a hard thing, the killing of those men, and Alexander was said to have been wounded again during it, though accounts differ on the details, as accounts always do when they are very old and have passed through many hands. The battle was over before the light failed entirely. The army camped on the far bank, the Granicus running quietly past them now, as though it had not just been the sight of terrible noise and effort, the water clearing as water always does, carrying away what it carries, and leaving the stones beneath clean and indifferent. Alexander sent 300 full sets of Persian armor back to Athens as an offering to the goddess Athena, with an inscription that spoke of the Greeks and Macedonians together having taken them from the barbarians of Asia. It was a political gesture as much as a religious one, a way of framing what had just begun as a continuation of the old Greek story, the story of West against East, civilization against strangeness. But the men who slept that night on the Asian bank of the Granicus knew that whatever story this was, it was only just beginning. The road east stretched away into the darkness, long and unknowable, past cities none of them had seen, and rivers none of them had names for, and the stars above Asia looked from down here not so very different from the stars above home. The water moved in the dark beside the camp, soft and continuous, the sound of it filling the spaces between the breathing of soldiers settling into sleep. And the night was cool, and the world was quiet, and there was nothing to do now but rest before the road resumed. In the days and weeks ahead, that road would wind through ancient coastal cities, through places where legend and stone were almost indistinguishable from one another, through a landscape dense with history and strangeness, and in one particular place, a great knotted rope that had been waiting, it was said, for exactly this kind of man. The road south from the Granicus wound through country that smelled of thyme and warm dust, of goat tracks and old stone walls baking in the afternoon sun, and Alexander's army moved through it all at the unhurried pace of men who have already won their first great victory and feel somewhere in their bones that the world is beginning to open before them like a slowly unrolled map. It is worth pausing here, if you will, and letting yourself settle into that landscape, the long column of soldiers moving through the valleys of Asia Minor, their sandals raising small clouds of pale dust that drifted sideways in the coastal breeze, the jangle and creak of equipment grown familiar over weeks of marching, the smell of horses and leather, and somewhere always the faint salt air coming off the Aegean to the west. The sun in those months would have been warm but not yet brutal, a sky a deep and absolute blue, of the kind that seems to press down on the hills with a kind of gentle weight, and the men who walked beneath it were young, most of them, full of the particular energy of soldiers who have been afraid and have come through the other side of fear into something steadier. The cities along the coast of Asia Minor had been Greek for generations, or had thought of themselves as Greek, which is perhaps the same thing, and as Alexander moved from one to the next, many of them opened their gates without a fight. The story goes with something close to relief, as though they had been waiting a long time to be reminded that they belonged to the world west of the Aegean and not to the vast Persian Empire that had held them in its administrative grip for so long. Sardis, one of the great inland cities of Lydia, surrendered almost immediately, its citadel perched on a rock so steep and sheer that it had never been taken by force in living memory, and yet its Persian garrison came down from those heights and laid their weapons aside, and Alexander walked into the city with the measured calm of a man collecting something that was already his. He is said to have been generous in those early days, generous in a way that was also strategic, it is true, but generous nonetheless, restoring local customs, reducing taxes, allowing the cities to govern themselves under their own laws, which was a thing the Persian administration had not always bothered to permit. From Sardis, he moved toward the coast, toward Ephesus, one of the most beautiful cities in the ancient world, a place where the great temple of Artemis stood, one of the wonders of that age, its columns white as milk, and so numerous that a person standing inside that forest of stone could lose the horizon entirely. It is said that Alexander arrived in Ephesus on the very day the temple had been badly damaged by fire, and that some around him took this as a sign of divine favor, as though the goddess herself had been away from her house that day, busy attending to the birth of a king. Whether or not one believes in such signs, the image is a beautiful one, and it lingers, the smoke still rising from the damaged portico, the smell of scorched cedar and incense and ash, and Alexander standing at the threshold of that enormous sacred space, looking in with those pale, mismatched eyes of his, one said to be dark, one said to be light, as though he saw the world in two registers at once. He offered to pay for the temple's restoration. The Ephesians declined politely, with the particular diplomacy of a people who understood that some gifts come with obligations attached. But the offer itself was noted and remembered and passed down, which may have been precisely the point. The army continued inland then, northward and eastward, into the higher country where the air grew cooler and the roads narrowed between ridges of pine. And it was in this interior landscape that Alexander came at last to Gordium, the old capital of ancient Phrygia, a city that carried within it a story so old that even then, in the 4th century before the birth of Christ, no one was entirely certain where the history ended and the legend began. Gordium was the city of Midas, or had been once, Midas of the Golden Touch, whose name still clung to the surrounding hills like old smoke. And in the city's central sanctuary there stood an object that had accumulated centuries of meaning, an ox cart, said to be the very cart belonging to a man named Gordius, the father of Midas himself, who had once arrived in this place as a poor farmer and been made king by an oracle's proclamation. The cart was tied to a post with a knot of cornel bark, a knot so elaborately constructed, the story goes, that its ends were hidden entirely, folded into the body of the binding so that no one who looked at it could find where to begin. And an old prophecy had grown up around it over the years, that whoever could untie the knot would rule all of Asia. You can imagine, perhaps, what it meant for Alexander to stand before that knot. He was 23 years old, or close to it. He had already crossed from Europe into Asia. He had already defeated a Persian army. He had already collected city after city along a coast that had been under foreign rule for longer than most of its inhabitants could remember. And here, in this old dusty sanctuary that smelled of wood and time and the accumulated prayers of many generations, was a piece of rope, twisted into a shape that no one had ever been able to unravel. The accounts of what happened next differ in their particulars, as accounts of famous moments almost always do. Some say Alexander studied the knot for a long while, turning it over in his mind, the way he had learned to turn problems over under Aristotle's patient instruction, looking for the logical thread that would let the whole thing come loose. Some say he simply drew his sword and cut it. Others say he pulled the pin from the pole itself so that the knot slid free without being untied at all, which would have been, and here one can almost hear the quiet amusement in the old sources, exactly the kind of solution that is neither cheating nor quite playing fair, and that satisfies no one and everyone simultaneously. It is said that night, as the army settled into their fires and their bread and their conversation, a great thunderstorm rolled in over the hills of Phrygia, and that this was taken as confirmation from Zeus himself that the solution had been accepted, whatever form it had taken. Whether the gods thundered their approval or not, the men believed it, which is perhaps what mattered most. The march continued southward and eastward through the warm weeks that followed, through country that grew more varied the further they went. Olive groves giving way to cedar forests opening onto broad plains where the light fell in long golden angles in the late afternoon, the kind of light that makes even dust look beautiful, that turns the ordinary colors of the world into something richer and more saturated than they have any right to be. The coastal cities of Cilicia came to them one by one, some easily, some with more negotiation, and Alexander administered them all with that particular combination of firmness and pragmatism that had already become his signature, replacing Persian-appointed governors with Macedonian officers, or where it seemed wise, with local men who had proven their cooperation. There is something almost peaceful about this stretch of the campaign, looking back at it across all those centuries of intervening time, the slow, purposeful movement through ancient landscapes, the gathering of cities like flowers into a basket, the days punctuated by the sound of sandals on stone roads, and the smell of the cooking fires that went up each evening as the army made its camp. The small orange lights of those fires scattered across the darkening hills like a reflection of the stars that were coming out above them. Alexander himself is said to have swum in the Hydaspes River during these weeks, a cold and swift river running down from the mountains of Cilicia, and the swim nearly killed him. the chill of the water sending him into a violent fever that had his doctors terrified and his generals standing anxious at the edges of his tent. He recovered, as he almost always seemed to recover, with the particular stubbornness of a young body that had not yet been persuaded that it was mortal. But those who watched him shivering by the lamplight, pale and sweating, saw something they would remember later, in other circumstances, in other years. For now, though, he lived, and the army moved on, and the road ahead was leading them toward a meeting with the Persian king himself, with Darius and his enormous host, somewhere out among the warm autumn plains to the east, a meeting that would settle something large and consequential about the shape of the world. But that encounter still lay a little way ahead, around the next bend in that long ancient road, and for now the fires were burning quietly in the Cilician night, and the stars were very clear, and the army rested. The night before the battle, it is said, the fires of two great armies faced one another across a narrow coastal plain, and the smoke of 10,000 campfires rose together into the same dark sky, mingling somewhere above the earth where neither army could claim it, drifting out toward the sea that lay patient and indifferent to the west, its waves making their slow, unhurried sound against the shore as they had always done and would always do, long after every soldier sleeping beneath those fires had returned to the ground. The place was called Issus, a narrow corridor of land where the mountains of what is now southern Turkey come pressing down close to the sea, leaving only a thin strip of coastal plain between the high ridges and the water. And it was here, in the autumn of the year 333 before the birth of Christ, that Alexander of Macedon and Darius III, king of kings, ruler of the greatest empire the world had yet known, met one another in battle for the first and only time. The narrowness of the ground was, in the way that history sometimes arranges its ironies gently, a gift to Alexander, for Darius had brought an enormous army, an army whose numbers ancient sources give so extravagantly that modern scholars smile and set them gently aside, though it is agreed by all that the Persians vastly outnumbered the Macedonians, and that in any broader, flatter field, that weight of numbers might have decided everything. But here, pressed between the mountains and the sea, the long Persian lines could not spread wide enough to outflank the Macedonians, and what Darius had brought as overwhelming force became, in that narrow place, something more unwieldy, something harder to steer. Alexander, it is said, rode along his lines before the battle, as he always did, speaking to men by name where he could, calling out to units by their home regions, reminding each soldier of what they had already survived together, and the men who heard him felt, or so the ancient accounts suggest, something kindle in them that was not quite courage alone, but something more particular, a feeling of being known, of mattering, which is perhaps the most powerful thing any leader can offer to a frightened person, standing at the edge of a terrible morning. The river Panaris ran between the two armies, shallow enough to cross but cold, and when the Macedonian advance began, the men waded through it and felt the cold water at their knees, the smooth stones shifting underfoot, and then they were climbing the far bank, and the noise of battle was everywhere at once. The fighting was close and terrible, the kind that ancient sources describe in blunt, spare language as if even words flinched from it, and the Persian left and center, pressed hard, began to give way and then to break, and when Darius himself, high on his great chariot at the center of the Persian line, saw the Macedonian cavalry driving toward him through the dissolving ranks of his own men, the story goes that he turned his chariot and fled. There is a painting of this moment, or rather a mosaic made centuries later from an earlier painting now lost, discovered in the ruins of a house in Pompeii, and in it you can see Darius looking back over his shoulder with an expression that has been debated ever since, whether it is fear or grief, or simply the look of a man making a cold calculation about survival. And the answer, as with so many things that reach us from that distant world, remains gently, softly uncertain. The battle ended, as battles do, not all at once but gradually, the fighting dying down in one quarter and then another, the shouting giving way to the particular exhausted quiet that falls over a field when the outcome is no longer in doubt. And Alexander, it is said, was wounded in the thigh during the fighting, a wound he seems to have noted and then largely ignored in the way that was characteristic of him. This tendency to treat his own body's complaints as minor administrative matters to be dealt with later. What came after the battle is, in its own way, as remarkable as the battle itself, and it carries a quality of stillness that is worth settling into slowly. Among those who had not fled with Darius was his family, his mother Sysigambis, a woman of great age and great dignity, his wife Statera, described in the ancient sources with the kind of reverent, almost helpless admiration that suggests she was genuinely beautiful in a way that stopped people, his 2 daughters, and a young son. They had been left behind in the Persian baggage train, which the Macedonians had captured, and when Alexander's officers found them, they found them gathered together in the royal tent, and the women were weeping, believing, as the story goes, that Darius was dead. Alexander sent word to them that night through his companion Leonidas that Darius was alive, that they would be treated with all the honor due to a royal family, that nothing would be taken from them, and nothing would harm them. This message, delivered quietly in the smoky warmth of a great tent, while the fires of the victorious army burned outside, seems to have been received with something between relief and disbelief, which is understandable, given what the women of a conquered family had reason to expect in that world. The following morning, it is said, Alexander came to visit them himself, bringing with him Hephaestion, his closest companion, the friend he had known since boyhood, tall and handsome in the way the ancient sources consistently describe him. And what happened next has been passed down through multiple ancient accounts with a quality of gentle theater that makes it feel almost too perfectly arranged, though that does not mean it did not happen. Sysigambis, the grandmother, the queen mother of Persia, mistook Hephaestion for Alexander because Hephaestion was taller, and she prostrated herself before him in the Persian manner, offering him the formal submission of a conquered queen. And then someone quietly indicated her error, and she drew back, and there was a moment of profound embarrassment. And Alexander, by all accounts, made it pass as gracefully as such a moment can be made to pass. He said, it is reported, something to the effect that she had not been wrong, for Hephaestion was also Alexander, meaning, in the intimate private language of their friendship, that they were so close as to be one thing. Whether he said exactly those words in exactly that way, we cannot know with certainty, but the spirit of the gesture seems to have been characteristic of him in his better moments. This instinct for the generous response, the refusal to allow another person's humiliation to deepen. He stayed and spoke with the royal women. He was, the sources agree, respectful, careful, kind in a way that clearly surprised them. He addressed Statera with formality and courtesy. He treated Sysigambis with the deference one gives to an elder, and it is said that she felt this, that she received it, and that something passed between them that resembled, in its quieter way, a kind of adoption, as if the old woman found in this young conqueror something she could recognize, some quality to bend her understanding toward. The ancient sources tell us that in later years she came to care for Alexander with something like genuine maternal feeling, that when she eventually learned of his death, she refused food and died herself within a few days. This reaches us from a great distance and through many retellings, and we hold it gently. The tent itself, as described in the ancient accounts, was a thing of overwhelming richness, the Persian royal tent of campaign, hung with fabrics and lit with oil lamps whose light fell warmly across gold vessels and embroidered cloth, across the scented air of incense and cedar. And Alexander is said to have stood in it and remarked to his companions quietly, something like, "This, then, is what it is to be a king," not said with envy or greed, but with something more like wonder, as if the sheer material texture of the Persian world was only now becoming real to him, only now pressing itself into his understanding, lamp by lamp, shadow by shadow, through the long warm air of that captured royal night. Outside, the sea moved in the darkness, indifferent as always, its slow rhythm unchanged by battle or by victory, by grief or by the strange tender negotiations happening in the firelit tent on the narrow coastal plain. And as the camp settled into the deeper quiet of the small hours, the lamps burned lower, and the great army breathed together in its scattered sleep, and the world, for a moment, held still. The road ahead would carry Alexander deeper into Persian territory, toward ancient cities and warm harbors, toward a land rich with grain and spice, and the long memory of old civilizations, and toward Egypt, which was waiting in its golden patience at the edge of the desert, with a god ready to make him a gift of a name. The sand here holds the warmth of the sun long after the sun itself has gone, radiating upward through the soles of sandals and the thin leather of boots. A gentle, persistent heat that the desert keeps like a secret, like something it borrowed from the light and is not yet ready to return. It was into this warmth, this ancient, patient warmth, that Alexander and his army descended in the autumn of the year 332 before the birth of Christ, crossing out of the long coastal campaigns of Asia Minor and into a land so old that even the Persians who had ruled it for 2 generations felt like newcomers upon its surface, like birds perched briefly on the shoulder of something that had been standing still for 10,000 years. Egypt received Alexander not as a conqueror, but as something closer to a redeemer. And this distinction matters because it settles the texture of everything that followed. The Persian occupation, under the rule of a satrap named Macedon, had not been a gentle one, and the story goes that the Egyptians had long chafed beneath it, their ancient priesthoods diminished, their sacred traditions viewed with something between indifference and contempt by their Persian administrators. And so when Alexander arrived, when the word spread along the delta and down the long green corridor of the Nile, that a young Macedonian king was approaching, there was no great resistance, no marshalling of forces at the border, no last desperate stand. Macedon, finding himself without an army to speak of after the catastrophe at Issus had swallowed the Persian forces whole, simply opened the gates. He handed over the treasury, he stepped aside, and Egypt exhaled. Alexander entered Memphis, the ancient capital, walking through streets that smelled of papyrus and river mud, and the sweet, heavy perfume of temple incense that had been drifting from the same stone sanctuaries for longer than anyone could calculate. He made sacrifices to the Egyptian gods with a seriousness and a reverence that was not merely diplomatic, or perhaps it was diplomatic, and also something more than that. For Alexander had always found genuine fascination in the sacred, in the idea that the divine could take different shapes in different latitudes, could wear different faces without being diminished. He honored Apis, the sacred bull, in the ancient manner, and the priests noticed and the people noticed, and what might have been a military occupation began to feel, at least in those first glowing weeks, more like a homecoming. But it was not Memphis that would hold Alexander's attention for long. His mind was already reaching westward along the coast, toward a particular stretch of shoreline he had observed. It is said, while sailing along the Mediterranean edge of the delta, a narrow band of land between the sea to the north and Lake Mareotis to the south, a place where the wind came off the water in long, steady, cooling streams, where 2 harbors might be made, one facing the open sea and one facing the lake and the interior, a place that seemed to have been set aside by the landscape itself for a city of consequence. The story goes that Alexander dreamed of this city before it was laid out, that in the night he saw it whole, its colonnaded streets, and its lighthouse and its library, and its harbor lights reflected in dark water, and that he woke with such certainty about the thing that had not yet been built, that he simply began building it. Whether the dream is history or legend or something comfortably between the two, the impulse it describes feels true, feels consistent with the man who moved through the world as though the world were slightly unfinished, and awaiting his corrections. He called for his architects. He walked the ground himself, marking out where the streets should run, where the agora should sit, where the temples should face. It is said that when they ran out of chalk for marking the lines in the earth, the soldiers used grain from their own rations, scattering it across the sand in long white curves, and that when birds descended and ate the grain, some among the company took this as an ill omen, but that Alexander's seers assured him it meant instead that the city would feed the world, that it would be a city of abundance. And Alexander chose to believe the better interpretation, because he nearly always did. Before the city could rise, however, there was the matter of the oracle. Somewhere in the western desert, far out beyond the edge of the green and cultivated world, beyond the last date palms and the last slow canals, in a place called Siwa that lay in a depression in the Libyan sand like a cupped hand holding a small green miracle. There was a temple to the god Amun, and the oracle within that temple was said to speak with a clarity and an accuracy that drew pilgrims from across the known world. Alexander decided he must go. The journey was neither comfortable nor brief. The route wound out through desert that offered little shade and less water, and the story goes that the company lost their way at one point in a landscape that looked identical in every direction, until, it is said, a pair of ravens appeared and led them forward. Or perhaps it was two snakes, the accounts shifting gently depending on who was telling the tale and in what century. The desert did what deserts do, which is to say it stripped everything back, reduced the world to light and sand and the sound of wind moving across a surface that did not resist it. And by the time the green oasis of Siwa appeared at the horizon, it must have seemed like something dreamed rather than something real. What passed between Alexander and the priests of Amun inside the sanctuary at Siwa, no one can say with certainty, because Alexander never fully disclosed it. What is known, or what the sources suggest, is that the priests greeted him in a form of address that called him son of the god, whether by design, by genuine belief, by a diplomatic calculation about how best to receive a conquering king, or by some accident of translation that Alexander then allowed to stand, it is not possible to say now, and perhaps was not entirely clear even then. What is said is that Alexander emerged from the innermost part of the sanctuary with an expression that those who knew him recognized as the look he wore when something had confirmed what he had already suspected, that quiet, particular satisfaction of a man who has received the answer he had already decided on. He wrote to his mother Olympias that he had received certain information from the god, information that he would share with her and her alone when he returned. And if that letter was ever written, and she ever received it, and they ever had that conversation, the content of it moved through the world without leaving a trace. He rode back through the desert with something settled in him, some inner arrangement newly ordered. The sand warm beneath his horse's hooves, and the sky above the desert an impossible blue that deepened toward evening into shades of violet and copper, and then into the clear, cold black of desert night, where the stars burned without interference from any lamp or fire for as far as the eye could reach in any direction. And then he returned to the coast, to the strip of ground between the sea and the lake, to the lines that had been drawn in grain and in chalk and in imagination, and the city began in earnest, its foundations dug into Mediterranean sand, its future shimmering in the heat above the building stones as they were cut and placed and mortared into the outlines of something that would outlast almost everything Alexander ever made, that would carry his name across 2,000 years and more, that would one day hold the greatest library the ancient world had ever assembled, all of human knowledge gathered in one place, like light gathered through a lens, burning brilliantly, briefly, in the long dark of history. For now it was only foundations and surveyors' lines, and the sound of stone on stone, and the smell of the sea, coming in steadily off the water, salt and iodine and the faint sweetness of distant rain falling somewhere out beyond the horizon. The evening came softly over the building site, the laborers drifting away to their fires, the architects rolling their papyrus plans and tucking them under their arms, the last light turning the limestone foundations to the color of warm honey, before the shadows took everything and left only the sound of the sea, steady and unhurried, measuring the night in its own ancient rhythm. Tomorrow the army would begin its long march eastward again, back into Persia, toward the heartland of the empire that was still waiting to be finished. But tonight, the sea moved against the shore of what would one day be Alexandria, and in the deepening dark, the city dreamed itself slowly into being, stone by patient stone, as you drift now toward the quiet country of your own sleep. The oil has just been poured, and the wick catches. It is a small thing this moment, a fingertip steadying a clay lamp, the faintest thread of smoke rising and then dissolving, and then the warm amber glow spreading outward across a whitewashed wall like a slow tide coming in across pale sand. It happens 10,000 times in a single evening, in a single Persian city, this lighting of lamps. In the houses of merchants and the houses of weavers, in the cool back rooms of bread sellers and the deep columned halls of minor governors, the oil catches and the darkness retreats a little, and the night becomes something softer, something inhabited, something that holds the people within it like a hand cupped gently around a flame. Let yourself settle into this city now. Let it be one of the great trading cities of the Persian heartland, a place that has stood for generations beyond easy counting. Its streets worn smooth by sandaled feet and the slow, patient hooves of mules, its walls the color of dried earth, warm and close, still breathing out the heat of the afternoon long after the sun itself has gone. The sky above is deepening now through shades of amber and rose and then a blue so dark and clear it seems to ring like a bell struck softly somewhere very far away. The first stars are appearing, one and then another and then too many to follow, spreading across that darkness with the unhurried confidence of things that have always been there and always will be. The streets at this hour are not yet quiet. They are simply changing. The loud commerce of midday, the raised voices, the creak of cartwheels over uneven stone, the rhythmic call of sellers announcing their figs and their copper bowls and their bolts of dyed cloth, all of that has softened and settled. What moves through the streets now is slower, more personal. A man walks with his hands folded behind his back, his thoughts moving ahead of him. Two women pass beneath an archway, speaking to one another in lowered voices, their shawls pulled close not against cold, but against the particular privacy that evening affords. A boy runs past them both and disappears around a corner and is gone, swallowed by the warm labyrinthine dark. And everywhere, drifting through the passageways between houses and rising up above the roof lines into the cooling air, there is the scent of smoke and spice. It comes from the cooking fires, from the clay ovens built into the sides of kitchens where flatbread blisters and puffs against the heat of the clay and is turned by a careful hand. It comes from bundles of dried herbs hung from the rafters, cumin and coriander, and something resinous and sweet that has no name in any language you would recognize. It comes from the small clay burners placed near doorways where a pinch of incense has been laid on glowing coals as an offering, as a habit, as a gesture as old as the city itself, sending its thin perfumed thread upward into the night, as though making some unhurried and entirely private communication with the sky above. Step inside a doorway if you like. There is nothing here to startle you. The house is modest, but not poor, the kind of house that has been added to over many years. A room here, a courtyard there, a low wall to keep the goats separate from the kitchen garden, where mint and dark left herbs crowd together in the last of the evening warmth. In the central courtyard there is a shallow pool, the water still and dark, holding in its surface a trembling copy of the stars above. The sound of water here is almost nothing, just the faintest movement, just the memory of sound, as though the water is breathing very slowly in its sleep. The family has eaten, or they are eating still. The meal unhurried and companionable. Small dishes pass between hands, bread torn and shared. A jar of something tart and cool, poured into cups that have been used so long, their rims have worn smooth and kind. The conversation, if there is conversation, is the kind that requires no great attention. The easy murmur of people who have known each other a long time, who have said most things already, and are comfortable now with what remains. A lamp sits at the center of the low table, and the faces around it are golden, softened, drawn close by the light as though the flame itself were a quiet voice, asking them to stay a little longer. Above the city, the great fire temples hold their permanent light. It is said that in the holiest of these temples, the sacred flame has never been extinguished, passed from priest to priest across generations, tended with a care that borders on the devotional, which is precisely what it is. The priests who tend these flames move through their duties at this hour with the measured gravity of men who understand that what they carry is not merely fire, but continuity itself, the warm thread connecting the living to the dead and the dead to whatever lies beyond knowing. The light they tend is old. It has seen empires rise and the faces of kings pass before it, and has remained burning, indifferent to conquest, indifferent to the names men give themselves and one another. In the market district, a few late sellers remain, their stalls lit by hanging lamps that sway slightly in whatever breath of wind finds its way down between the buildings. A carpet seller sits before a pile of rolled and folded textiles, their colors muted now in the lamplight to deep reds and soft ochres, the geometric patterns dissolving at the edges into shadow. He is not calling out any longer. He is simply present, patient, available, in the manner of a man who has made his peace with the pace of things. A scribe sits nearby, his work finished for the day, his reed pen tucked away, watching the people pass with the mild, detached interest of a man who has spent the day writing down other people's words and is content for a time to simply observe without recording. The smells of the evening shift as the night deepens. The bread smell fades, and what rises instead is the cool mineral scent of stone releasing its stored warmth, the dry sweetness of dust that has been still for hours, the faint green breath of the irrigation channels that run through the lower quarter of the city, bringing water down from the mountains in steady, purposeful streams that murmur to themselves through the dark. These channels are very old. They were dug, the story goes, by men whose names are no longer remembered, working with tools simpler than any that exist now, moving enormous quantities of earth with patience and ingenuity, and the particular determination of people who understood that water is life, and that life is worth extraordinary effort. High in one of the houses, a musician is playing. You do not hear it clearly, just the edge of it, the shape of a melody without its detail, something plucked on strings that shimmers and falls and shimmers again. It is not performed for anyone, or perhaps it is performed for the performer alone, which is the most honest kind of music, the kind that asks nothing of its listeners, except that they not mind it floating past them in the dark. It threads out of an upper window and into the street below, and someone passing lifts their face slightly toward it without breaking their stride, receiving it without comment, carrying it away with them as they walk, not sleeping yet, not quite, but moving in that long, gentle interval between the end of the day's purpose and the full surrender to the night. Somewhere, a dog settles against a warm wall with a sigh of tremendous finality. Somewhere, a child is being told a story in a quiet voice, the teller's words arriving in that particular unhurried cadence that carries a small person toward sleep, without their quite noticing the boundary being crossed. Somewhere, a very old man sits on a rooftop looking at the stars, with the expression of someone reviewing something familiar, and still, after all this time, finding it sufficient. The lamps burn on, the incense thins and rises, the city breathes. And it is worth resting here for a moment, in this warmth, in this amber quiet, before we move on, because the world of great campaigns and enormous distances and the noise of armies is waiting just at the edge of things, and in the next chapter, we will be drawn back into it, back toward Persepolis, the grandest city of all, and the fate that was coming for it slowly from the west. But that is for later. For now, there is only this, the lamp, the scent of warm stone and spice, and a thread of incense climbing into the dark. The quiet pool in the courtyard catching starlight in its still and patient surface. Let it hold you here a little while longer. The road east from the coast smelled of dust and distance, of leather worn soft by 1,000 miles of marching, of horses and wood smoke, and the particular dry sweetness of a land that receives very little rain and holds its heat long into the evening. Alexander's army moved through the interior of the Persian Empire, the way a river moves through a landscape it has already shaped, with a kind of inevitability, with a slow and gathering momentum that the hills and passes could slow but never quite stop. Behind them lay the smoking ruins of Persepolis' outer gates. Ahead lay nothing but the high plateau of Persia itself, and all around them the ancient world breathed in slow cycles of heat and cold, light and shadow, the same rhythms it had breathed for 10,000 years before any of them were born. The march to Persepolis had been long, and it had not been gentle. The army had descended from the mountains of the Persian gates, where a Persian commander named Ariobarzanes had held a narrow pass with a force of perhaps 40,000 men, and made Alexander pay in blood and cold and frustration for every step of the way down into the heartland. The story goes that it was a local shepherd, a man whose name the ancient sources do not trouble themselves to preserve, who led a Macedonian flanking column along a secret path through the snow-covered heights, around and behind the Persian position, so that when morning came the defenders of the gates found themselves caught between two armies, and the pass became not a triumph, but a catastrophe for Persia. Alexander arrived at Persepolis in midwinter, in the month that the Greeks might have called Gamalion, when the air at that altitude carried a cold that crept under cloaks and settled into bones, and the torch flames the soldiers carried guttered and streamed sideways in the mountain wind. Persepolis was not like anything the Macedonian soldiers had seen before. and it is worth resting quietly here for a moment, to simply let the place exist in the mind as it was, as those tired, wind-burned men would have seen it approaching in the gray winter light. It was a city built on a vast artificial terrace of stone, a platform raised above the surrounding plain by the labor of 10,000 hands across generations. And upon that terrace rose palaces and audience halls of a scale that made the grandest buildings of Greece look modest and provincial. There were staircases wide enough for 10 horsemen to ride abreast, their stone balustrades carved with processions of tribute bearers from every corner of the Persian world, men from Egypt and India and Scythia and Lydia, and a dozen other places, each rendered with careful attention, each carrying the particular gifts of their particular land, so that the whole staircase became a kind of stone map of the world, as Darius the Great had imagined it 2 centuries before. There were columns of polished stone that rose to heights which seemed almost impossible, their capitals carved into the shapes of bulls and lions, their surfaces still bearing traces of paint in deep reds and blues and golds that had not yet entirely faded. And there were the treasury rooms, deep and cool and shadow-filled, where generations of Persian kings had accumulated wealth in quantities that the Macedonian officers, when they counted it, found almost impossible to comprehend. It is said that the treasure taken at Persepolis required 5,000 camels and 20,000 mules to carry it away. Whether or not that precise number is accurate, the ancient sources agree that it was extraordinary, that it represented something like the accumulated tax receipts of an empire that had been gathering wealth from 3 continents for more than 2 centuries. Alexander moved through the treasury rooms in torchlight, and the flames would have caught the edges of gold vessels and silver bars and painted stone, throwing everything into warm and dancing shadow, the light shifting and breathing as the torches moved through air that smelled of old stone and cedar and the particular dry mineral scent of immense quantities of coined metal stored for a very long time in enclosed spaces. He stayed in Persepolis for some months. The ancient sources say it was 4 months, though some put the figure slightly differently, and during that time the city functioned as a kind of strange, suspended thing, not entirely conquered in the sense of being destroyed, not entirely preserved in the sense of being left untouched. The palace of Xerxes, which the Persians called the Hall of 100 Columns, was opened and explored and filled with the noise of Macedonian soldiers who walked through its vast spaces and looked up at its painted ceilings and spoke to one another in low voices, the way people always speak in places that make them feel small. Alexander held court there. He sat in the great audience hall where Persian kings had received the tribute of the world, and for a few months the world reorganized itself around that new center, and dispatches came and went, and decisions were made about the governance of conquered territories, and in the evenings there was wine. It is the wine that the ancient sources point toward when they try to explain what happened to Persepolis, though most modern historians are careful to note that the full truth is probably more complicated than a single night of celebration. The story goes, and it is one of the most famous and most debated stories of the ancient world, that during one of these evening gatherings, when the lamps and torches were burning low, and the wine had been flowing freely, an Athenian woman named Thais, who traveled with the court and was said to be the companion of one of Alexander's generals, spoke words to the effect that the greatest satisfaction available to them in all of Asia would be to burn the palace of Xerxes, to pay back in fire and ash the burning that Xerxes had visited upon Athens a century and a half before. And it is said that the words caught fire in the room the way words sometimes do when the moment is right and the wine is present, and the weight of a very long journey has loosened something in the men who have made it. Whether it happened that way, or whether the burning of Persepolis was a more deliberate political act, a signal to the Persian world that the old order was truly finished, that there was no going back to what had been, is something that historians have debated for centuries without arriving at perfect agreement. Perhaps Alexander watched the first flames take hold of the cedar beams of Xerxes' palace, and felt simultaneously the hot satisfaction of symbolic revenge, and the cooler, more calculated sense that burning was a message that would be understood across the entire Persian world. The ancient writer Arian, who wrote about Alexander several centuries after the events themselves, suggests that Alexander later regretted the burning. The writer Plutarch says something similar. It is worth holding that detail gently. the image of a man who had done something enormous and irreversible, standing in the light of his own decision, and feeling, perhaps, that it was not quite what he had imagined it would be. The cedar burned with a particular intensity, fragrant and fierce, and the stone columns stood in the flames like patient witnesses, too old and too heavy to be consumed, but surrounded on all sides by destruction. Their carved faces of bulls and lions flickering in the light. The tribute bearers on the staircases suddenly illuminated in ways they had never been illuminated in all the careful ceremonial lighting of the Persian court. The night air above Persepolis would have been thick with smoke and heat and the smell of burning cedar, and the sparks would have risen in great spiraling columns and drifted out over the surrounding plain in slow wandering arcs before winking out one by one in the cold dark air above the plateau. By morning, the great halls were ruined. The columns still stood as they stand still today in the Iranian desert, patient and enormous and beautiful in their way, holding up nothing but the open sky, stripped of everything that the fire could take and left with everything the fire could not. The stone staircases with their processions of tribute bearers survived. The platform survived. The bones of the place survived, as bones do, long after everything else is gone. Alexander moved on. He always moved on. And the army gathered itself up in the weeks that followed. The camels and mules were loaded with their extraordinary burdens of gold and silver, and the long columns began to form again on the road that led northeast toward Ecbatana and the fugitive Darius and the vast unmapped distances of Central Asia. The days were lengthening now, as winter released its grip on the high plateau, and the light each evening was softer and stayed later in the sky, and the soldiers who marched in it were men who had already traveled further from home than any Greek army before them, and who did not yet know how much further they would go. The torchlight was not needed until much later in those slowly warming evenings, and when it finally came, it burned steadily in air that no longer tried to snuff it out, calm and golden and patient, as the world prepared itself, quietly and without announcement, for whatever was to come next. The fires have been burning for a long time now, and the army walks on, beyond Persepolis, beyond the charred memory of Darius's great halls, the world that Alexander's soldiers had imagined. That gleaming, finite world of Persian gold and Persian surrender began to dissolve at the edges, like the borders of a map drawn in water-soluble ink. They had expected an ending. They found instead that the earth simply continued, range after range of mountains rising into a pale and indifferent sky, valley floors of loose shale and wind-scoured dust, stretching away into distances that seemed to mock the very idea of arrival. The campaign that followed Persepolis is not the campaign of bright banners and triumphal processions. It is something older, slower, and far harder to hold in the mind. It is the campaign of the campfire in a foreign dark, of sandals worn through on stones that have no name in any Greek tongue, of men who had marched from the warm Aegean world into a place where even the cold felt different, sharper, more personal, as though the mountains themselves were expressing disapproval. This is the chapter that asks the most patience, from Alexander and from those who follow him across the centuries in imagination alone, and it is worth settling into slowly, because it is in these grinding, bewildering years that something important happens. Not a battle won or a city founded, but a quieter transformation, a man becoming something stranger and more solitary than the golden prince who had once sat at Aristotle's feet and asked careful questions about the nature of the soul. After the fall of Persepolis, Alexander pursued Darius northeastward into the province the Persians called Parthia, through landscapes of extraordinary harshness, salt flats that threw the midday sun back into the faces of the soldiers like a second lower sky, and nights of such concentrated cold that water left in bronze cups turned to ice before dawn. It was in this relentless motion that word came at last. Darius III, the king of kings, had been killed by his own men, by the Bactrian satrap Bessus, who had taken him captive, and when Alexander's cavalry drew close enough to threaten rescue, ran him through with javelins and left him in a cart by the road. The story goes that Alexander arrived just in time to find the king still barely breathing, and that he removed his own cloak and placed it over the dying man, and that Darius managed a few words of gratitude before the light left him entirely. Whether this is precisely as it happened, no one can say with certainty, but the gesture is recorded by more than one ancient voice, and it carries the ring of something Alexander would have done, for he thought very seriously about the obligations of the strong toward the fallen, even when the campfires were cold and the men were exhausted, and the next range of mountains was already visible on the horizon. Bessus fled into Bactria, declaring himself the new king of Persia, under the name Artaxerxes, and Alexander, who took the legitimacy of kingship seriously in ways that could be both noble and unnerving, felt compelled to follow him, and so the army turned northeastward, into the lands that the Greeks understood only vaguely, if at all, the high passes of the Hindu Kush, those enormous mountains that rise in successive waves like frozen waves of stone, each one higher and colder and more indifferent than the last. The crossing of the Hindu Kush was, by most accounts, a misery of particular intensity. Snow-blinded men on the passes, horses that had survived the plains of Persia went lame on the ice. Provisions ran short, and the army burned whatever fat they had preserved from slaughtered pack animals, and chewed on silphium root, which tasted of nothing the tongue could translate into comfort. There were fires at each camp, small and determined, fed by whatever wood the advance parties could gather from the sparse tree line below the snowfields. And around those fires the Macedonian soldiers, men who had grown up in the mountain warmth of home, who remembered the smell of their own hearth smoke, of pine resin and mutton fat, and the particular sweet char of a Macedonian winter fire, sat and did not speak very much, because some distances are too great for conversation. Beyond the mountains lay Bactria, a land of extraordinary contrasts, green river valleys of almost violent fertility, pressed between deserts of total aridity, cities of mud brick that had been trading crossroads for centuries, populations that moved with a fluid, nomadic confidence that the Greek and Macedonian soldiers found simultaneously admirable and unsettling. It was here, in the province of Sogdiana, the land north of Bactria, watered by the Oxus and Jaxartes rivers, that Alexander encountered the most determined and resourceful resistance of his entire campaign. Unlike the great Persian armies that had met him on open ground at Granicus and Issus, the Sogdian chieftains and their fighters used the landscape itself as a weapon. They retreated into mountain fortresses, burned their own grain stores, melted into the hills when the Macedonian phalanx advanced, and reappeared behind it when it passed. This went on not for weeks, but for years. The sources suggest it lasted roughly 3 years in this region, though the exact chronology is uncertain. And those years grounded Alexander's army in ways that no single great battle ever had. There is a particular fortress that the ancient sources describe with a kind of awed reluctance, the Sogdian Rock, a great massif of stone rising so sheer from the valley floor that its defenders shouted down to Alexander's heralds that he would need soldiers with wings to take it. It is said that Alexander responded by calling for volunteers who could climb, and that he offered rewards of land and gold to the first men to reach the top, and that somewhere between 270 and 300 men, depending on which account one reads, attempted the ascent in darkness, using iron tent pegs hammered into cracks in the rock as handholds, and that some fell and were lost in that darkness, and that the rest reached the summit in the gray hour before dawn and waved cloths downward, visible from below like small pale birds. The garrison, seeing soldiers appear as if from empty air above them, surrendered without further resistance. The story breathes of something true about these years. They demanded from Alexander a kind of problem-solving that went beyond the brilliance of Gaugamela, a willingness to attempt things that had no precedent and no guarantee. It was at the Sogdian Rock, or near it, that Alexander first encountered Roxana. She was the daughter of the Bactrian nobleman Oxyartes, one of the chieftains who had held the fortress, and who, upon surrendering, was treated with the formal generosity that Alexander extended to defeated enemies he considered worthy. Roxana's name in the Bactrian tongue meant something close to Little Star, or Bright One, and the sources, written long after the fact and with varying degrees of romanticization, agree that Alexander was struck by her immediately and profoundly. What is more unusual, and what strikes every historian who pauses to consider it, is that he married her, not as a political convenience alongside a Greek or Macedonian wife, but as a genuine marriage conducted with ceremony in the manner of the country. He is said to have cut a loaf of bread in two with his sword and shared it with her, which was a Bactrian wedding custom. His generals were, by various accounts, quietly astonished. His Macedonian officers had expected conquest in the usual forms. They had not expected their king to take a barbarian bride, that word being theirs, not ours, with evident sincerity, with something that looked, from the outside, very much like love. Whatever it was real enough to last. Roxana would remain with Alexander through what was yet to come, the further marches east, the monsoons, the river that would finally say no. She was, in some sense, the living evidence of how far Alexander had traveled from the world that had made him, and how completely the boundaries of that world had ceased to contain him. The campfires in Bactria burned low, fed by dried dung and scrub wood, throwing a thin reddish light across faces that had been young in Macedonia and were no longer quite so young here. The flames guttered in the wind that came off the high step, and the men leaned closer and spoke of home in the way that soldiers always speak of home, briefly, carefully, as though the word itself might break if handled too roughly. Somewhere to the east, beyond the last range of anything they had been taught to expect, the world continued, and in the morning Alexander would rise and face it, with his new wife and his tired army and his undiminished, extraordinary, slightly terrible need to know what lay beyond. The Indus waited, and the story moves that way now, gently, toward water and green jungle, and the sound of a river wider than anything a Macedonian shepherd had ever imagined. The monsoon had already changed the air by the time the army reached the far side of the world. There is a particular quality to the light in that part of the earth during the months of summer rain, a softness that has nothing gentle in it, a heaviness that presses down on everything like a warm, wet cloth laid over the face of the land. The mountains to the north disappeared behind curtains of gray mist. The rivers ran fast and brown and deep, carrying soil from places no Macedonian soldier had ever heard of. Places with names that dissolved in the mouth like unfamiliar spices. The grass grew to the height of a man's chest along the riverbanks, and insects sang in enormous, tireless choirs through the long, humid nights. This was India, or at least its western edge, the storied land that the Greeks had known only as a rumor, a place whispered about in Herodotus, in the old travelers' tales, a land of impossible wealth and stranger customs, of elephants and rivers so wide they seemed to be oceans dreaming of becoming land. Alexander had wanted this for a long time. He had wanted it the way he wanted most things, with a completeness that left little room for any other feeling. The Persians had once claimed parts of this territory, and so in his mind it was already his by right of inheritance, the inheritance he had taken by sword and endurance from Darius's crumbling empire. But there was more to it than that. There was always more to it than that with Alexander. The east called to him the way the horizon calls to a person standing at the edge of the sea, not because of what is there, but because of the sheer fact of it being beyond, being further, being more. He had crossed the Indus River in the spring, and the small kingdoms and chieftains he encountered along the way had, many of them, yielded without great bloodshed. Some sent delegations with gifts, richly worked cloth, unusual fruits, animals his soldiers stared at with open mouths. The air smelled of unfamiliar wood smoke and of flowers that had no Greek names. His men marched through it all with the numb endurance of soldiers who have been walking for years and have simply forgotten how to stop. Their sandals worn through, their armor repaired so many times it bore the fingerprints of a dozen different smiths. It was at the Hydaspes River that the great reckoning came. But first, there was a battle. On the far bank of the Hydaspes, swollen and fierce with monsoon water, waited Porus. The story of Porus is one that those who recorded it seem to find genuinely moving, even those writing in the service of Alexander's legend. He was a king of considerable territory in what is now the Punjab, and he was, by all accounts, a man of tremendous physical presence. It is said he stood well over 6 feet tall, which in any age commands attention, and that he carried himself with the unhurried dignity of someone who has never been given reason to doubt his own stature. He had war elephants, more than 100 of them, arranged in a great line along the bank, and even from a distance, the Macedonian soldiers could hear their low, rumbling calls drifting across the churning water. Alexander spent several nights studying the river, watching it, thinking. He was very good at this kind of patience, the patience before action, the still water before the current. He sent parties up and down the bank in the days before the crossing, making small demonstrations, keeping Porus's attention scattered, wearing at the nerves of the sentries on the far side. And then one night, in the middle of a storm, the rain coming down in warm, blinding sheets, thunder rolling across the sky in long, continuous waves, he moved. He took a chosen force, crossed several miles upstream where the bank curved and the view was obscured, and brought them across in boats and on rafts of inflated animal skins, the men crouching in the dark in the downpour, the river pulling at everything with cold, indifferent hands. By the time Porus knew where Alexander truly was, the battle had already begun to take its shape. What followed was a hard and costly fight, harder than many of the battles that had come before. Porus had arranged his elephants cleverly, and the great animals terrified the horses in a way that no amount of training had fully prepared them for. The Macedonian cavalry had to work around the flanks, pressing and pressing while the infantry engaged the elephant line directly, which was dangerous work of the most intimate and frightening kind. Men were trampled. The mud was deep from the rain and made every movement an effort. The noise was extraordinary. The screaming of horses, the trumpeting of elephants, the flat crack of javelins, the low continuous roar of many thousands of men in violent motion. But Alexander prevailed, as he had prevailed so many times before, and when Porus was finally brought to him, wounded, still sitting on his elephant, declining to dismount until the animal itself was persuaded to kneel, the meeting between them was one that the ancient sources linger over with something like affection. Alexander asked him how he wished to be treated. Porus said, it is reported, simply, as a king, and Alexander, whether from genuine admiration or from the political wisdom of creating a useful ally, gave him back his kingdom and in time expanded it. There is something in this exchange that feels true, even across the distance of all these centuries, two proud men recognizing in each other something worth the recognizing. Alexander named two cities on the banks of the Hydaspes, as was his habit, one Nicaea for victory and one Bucephala for his horse. Old Bucephalus, the great black horse that had been his companion since boyhood, had died after the battle, worn out at last by age and the long road from Macedon. He was somewhere in his late 20s, which is a very old age for a horse, and he had carried his rider through everything. The grief Alexander felt was, by all accounts, genuine and deep. He mourned the horse as he had mourned few people, but the army was beyond mourning. The army was beyond almost everything. They had been marching for 8 years of roads and rivers and mountains and deserts, of climates that swung from the killing cold of the Hindu Kush to the burning damp of the Indian summer. They had crossed into a world so far from home that home itself had become a kind of dream, a place they half believed in, the way you half believe in places from childhood. Real, certainly, but fading, but not quite accessible to the present body, the present aching feet. Their armor was old, their wounds were numerous. Many of them had wives and children in the new cities scattered across Persia and Bactria, children who had been born and had learned to walk while their fathers were still walking east. They wanted to go home. At the Hydaspes River, the next great river further east, the army stopped. It happened quietly, in the way that the most significant refusals sometimes do. The soldiers did not riot. They did not mutiny in any dramatic fashion. They simply gathered in their tents, and they wept. That is what the sources say. The men wept. Hardened soldiers who had crossed mountains in winter and fought elephants in the rain sat in their tents in the Indian monsoon and wept, and would not move. Alexander spoke to them, we are told, with all the force and eloquence he possessed. He reminded them of what they had done, of how far they had come, of what lay ahead. There were more kingdoms, more rivers, more of the world to take. Some accounts say he withdrew to his tent for 3 days in hope that they would change their minds. They did not change their minds. He called the omens unfavorable, it is said, and announced that the army would turn west. Whether he believed it, or whether it was a way of bending to necessity without appearing to bend, only he would have known. But he built 12 great altars on the bank of the Hydaspes, one for each of the Olympian gods, and left them there as a marker at the edge of his world, a set of monuments to the place where the going east finally ended. They stood on that river bank while the monsoon rain came down, those stone altars, gradually sinking into the soft ground, gradually being covered by the tall grass and the years, and the army turned. There is a particular sound to a large body of exhausted people moving in a direction that brings them closer to where they came from. Something lighter in the footfall, something almost like music in the way the voices carry. The river ran beside them as they began their long westward march, brown and full and indifferent to all of it, whispering along its banks the way rivers have always whispered, before armies and after them, through all the long, unrecorded nights of the world. They would not find the road home an easy one, but that is a story for the next quiet passage of the night. The sand remembers everything. Long after the armies have passed, long after the last sandal has pressed its brief impression into the dune, and the wind has smoothed even that small trace away, the desert holds a kind of memory in its stillness, in the particular quality of its silence, which is not the silence of emptiness, but the silence of a place that has witnessed too much, and chosen at last to say nothing. And it was into exactly this kind of silence that Alexander led his army westward, from the mouth of the Indus River, through the land the Greeks called Gedrosia, in what we would reckon as the late autumn and early winter of the 325th year before the birth of Christ, along a coast so barren and so hot that even the sea wind, when it came, seemed to carry heat rather than coolness, seemed to offer the memory of water rather than water itself. Let the thought of that landscape settle around you gently now, the way sand settles after a gust has passed, drifting down in slow veils, coming quietly to rest. The army that entered Gedrosia was not the same army that had crossed the Hellespont nearly a decade before. That earlier force had been taught with purpose, gleaming with the particular confidence of young men who had not yet been shown what the world could do to them. The force that now turned westward along the Macedonian coast was something else entirely, older in ways that had nothing to do with years, carrying its wounds not only in its bodies, but in some deeper place that the physicians could not reach and the priests could not name. There were tens of thousands of them, it is said, soldiers and their families, camp followers and merchants and servants, an entire traveling city, compressing itself into a column of movement that stretched back further than the eye could follow, raising a pale plume of dust that hung in the still air long after those who had made it had passed. Alexander rode near the front as he always had, though those who watched him closely in those weeks noted something in the set of his shoulders, in the particular way he held himself in the saddle, that suggested a man carrying weight that was not quite physical. He had chosen this route in part, the ancient sources tell us, because the great Persian king Cyrus and the Macedonian general Semiramis were said to have attempted it before him and failed, and Alexander, who had spent his entire adult life measuring himself against the impossible, could not resist the idea of succeeding where those great figures had not. It is also said that he intended to keep his fleet, commanded by the admiral Nearchus, supplied from the coast, a reasonable plan in a world of reliable water and navigable shore, but Gedrosia was not that world. The coast offered almost nothing, were often shallow and brackish. The vegetation was sparse and thorned. The mountains that pressed in from the north were not grand and dramatic in the way of the Hindu Kush, or the ranges Alexander had crossed on his way into Bactria, but sullen and low and featureless, as though the land itself had given up on the project of beauty and settled into a kind of permanent resentment. The heat during the daylight hours was absolute. The army learned quickly to march by night, moving through the hours of darkness, when the sand gave back some of the warmth it had absorbed during the day. The stars above them vast and indifferent, the only sound the shuffling of thousands of feet, and the occasional low voice, the creak of wagon wheels, the patient breath of animals. Torches and lamps moved through the darkness like a slow river of light, a glittering procession that must have seemed, from any great distance, almost beautiful, though those who carried those lights would not have used that word. Water was the great tyranny of Gedrosia, the thing that shaped every hour of every day and every decision of every officer. When water was found, men drank until they could drink no more, filled every vessel they carried, pressed wet cloth to the faces of the sick and the children. When water was not found, and there were stretches of days when it was not, the dying began quietly, and then with increasing speed, and the column contracted around its losses, and kept moving, because to stop was to die faster. It is recorded, in fragmentary accounts that have come down to us across 2 millennia, that on at least one occasion a small supply of water was brought to Alexander in a helmet, enough perhaps to ease his own thirst a little, and that he took the helmet in his hands and looked at it for a moment, and then poured it into the sand in front of his men, refusing to drink what could not be shared. Whether this moment unfolded precisely as described, it is impossible now to know, but it has the quality of something true, the quality of a gesture that belongs to the man as his other gestures belong to him. Floods came without warning from the mountains, night floods that roared down the dry watercourses and swept away tents and supplies, and people sleeping in the riverbed gullies that had seemed, in daylight, the most logical places to rest. There is a particular cruelty in a desert flood, in the way water arrives as disaster in a place where it has always been the deepest wish, and those who survived such nights and gathered themselves at dawn to continue westward did so with a kind of hollowed-out endurance that was different from courage, that was simply the body insisting on continuing past the point where the mind had any particular argument for doing so. Alexander moved among his men during those weeks. He dismounted and walked when the sun was at its worst, so that he would not seem to suffer less than they did. He shared rations when rations were short. He spoke to the dying when there was nothing else to give them. And yet the army shrank, the ancient sources suggest, considerably, though precise numbers have not survived in any reliable form, and the men who came out the other side of Gedrosia into the greener lands of Carmania to the west carried the desert inside them in some permanent way, a residue that rest and water and eventually wine could soften but not entirely dissolve. It was in Carmania, in those first days of relative relief, that Alexander began to receive reports of what had happened in the empire during the long Indian campaign, and the news was not the news a returning king wishes to hear. Satraps, the regional governors he had appointed to administer the vast territories his campaigns had accumulated, had in several cases behaved as though Alexander were never coming back, had taxed unjustly, had raised private armies, had treated the populations under their care with a freedom that suggested they expected no accounting. Treasuries had been depleted, monuments had been disturbed. It is said that some among the governing class had simply assumed that no man who marched to India and beyond could reasonably be expected to return, and had arranged their affairs accordingly. Alexander dealt with these matters with a sharpness that surprised even those who knew him well, a swiftness of retribution that moved through the administrative structures of the empire like a clean wind, sudden and without sentiment. He was not the same man who had left, and perhaps the governors who had gambled on his absence had not accounted for what the desert does to a man who survives it. The particular clarity it bestows, the way it burns away patience that might previously have been available. And yet, even in Carmania, even as the administrative corrections were being made and the army was resting, and the wine was flowing at the celebrations Alexander ordered partly for his men, and partly, perhaps, to remind himself that celebration was still a possibility, there was something in the air around him that those close to him found difficult to name. A restlessness, a quality of attention turned inward. The desert had taken something from him along with all the other things it had taken, and whatever that something was, it had not been recovered with the return of green land and fresh water and the sound of birds. The world he was returning to was not quite the world he had left, and Alexander himself, riding westward toward Babylon, toward the great golden city he had come to think of as the heart of his empire, was not quite the Alexander who had set out with such absolute certainty from the hills of Macedon all those years ago. But the road continued, as roads do, unspooling westward through the cooling evenings of late winter, and the lamps of the army moved along it, steady and small against the enormousness of the dark, the same light that had guided him through a decade of impossible distances, flickering now, but still burning, still casting its warm orange circle on the faces of the men who followed, and on the face of Alexander himself, tilted slightly upward, watching the road ahead. Babylon was waiting, and in the next chapter we will arrive there together, gently, in the warmth of lamplight, and rest a while in the city that would be the last Alexander ever knew. The torches were burning along the processional way when Alexander entered Babylon for the last time. Their flames held steady in the warm, windless air of early summer, throwing long amber ribbons of light across the glazed blue tiles of the Ishtar Gate, as the great procession moved beneath it. Slowly, without the urgency of conquest, more like a tide coming in than an army returning home. The city received him as it always had, with incense and crowds, and the low murmur of 1,000 languages pressed together in the streets. Babylonian merchants and Greek soldiers and Persian nobles and Egyptian priests, all mingling in that ancient, patient city that had watched empires rise and dissolve for longer than any living person could trace with any certainty. Babylon was already old when Alexander was young, already layered with the sediment of centuries, and it received this particular conqueror the way it had received all the others before him, with a kind of gracious, unhurried welcome that suggested it would still be standing long after his name had softened into legend. He came back changed. Those who knew him best could see that plainly. The years in the desert, the long retreat through Gedrosia, the loss of so many men to thirst and heat and simple exhaustion, the growing distance between himself and the companions who had followed him since boyhood, all of it had settled into him in ways that even he perhaps could not fully measure. He was 32 years old, which is very young for a man and very old for a conqueror, and the body that had survived arrows and spear thrusts and the grinding cold of the Hindu Kush was carrying now a quieter kind of damage, the accumulated weight of 11 years of almost continuous movement and effort. Still, he arrived in Babylon with plans, and this perhaps is the most human thing about him, that even then he was dreaming forward, sketching campaigns in his mind, talking of Arabia and the Western Mediterranean, imagining fleets and roads and cities not yet built, the way a man lying in warm darkness might imagine all the things he means to do tomorrow. The ancient sources disagree about many things, as ancient sources tend to do, but most of them find their way to a certain evening, a certain banquet, and a certain moment when something shifted. It is said that Alexander attended a celebration at the house of a Macedonian officer named Medius, one of those long Macedonian evenings of wine and firelight and conversation that could drift on until the stars had made their full, slow circuit overhead. The torches burned low and were replaced, and the wine moved around the room in the way it always did at such gatherings, and Alexander, it is said, drank deeply, as he sometimes did, though the stories of his drinking have been colored and recolored by so many hands over so many centuries that it is difficult now to know quite what weight to give them. What seems clear is that sometime in the hours that followed he felt unwell, and that this feeling did not pass the way such feelings usually pass, but instead deepened and settled in, like weather moving in from a far distance. He was carried back to his chambers in the palace that had once belonged to the kings of Persia, the great cedar-roofed rooms with their painted columns and their smell of cedar oil and old stone, and there he lay while the fever climbed. The physicians came, as physicians do, and they did what they could with what they knew, which was considerable for that age, though what they knew was still far short of what the situation required. The Macedonian officers began to gather, quietly, in corridors and courtyards, speaking in low voices the way people do when something enormous is happening, and no one yet wants to be the one to say it plainly. A rumor moved through the army camps outside the walls, soft and unsettling as smoke finding its way under a door, that the king was ill, that the king was very ill, that something was wrong. For several days he lingered in that warm and difficult place between the ordinary world and whatever lies beyond it. The torches burned in the corridors of the palace through the long nights, casting their patient light across the stone floors and the cedar beams, and outside the windows Babylon went on being Babylon, the river moving, the market stirring at dawn, the smell of bread and river mud and distant cook fires drifting up into air that was soft and heavy with the approach of summer. It is said that the officers were eventually allowed to file past him one by one, a slow procession of familiar faces, men who had crossed rivers and mountains and deserts with him, men who had held shields beside him and sat by fires with him and argued with him and loved him in the particular fierce way that soldiers love a commander who has brought them through impossible things. He could no longer speak, or could speak only with great difficulty. The sources are uncertain on this point, but it is said that he recognized each of them, and acknowledge them with his eyes or with some small movement of his hand. There is a question that has floated through the centuries like a lamp carried down a long corridor, never quite extinguished, and that is the question of what exactly killed him. Fever, certainly, but fevers have causes, and the historians and physicians who have turned their attention to this question across more than 2,000 years have offered many possibilities. Some have pointed to the cumulative damage of his wounds, of which there were many, and some of which had been genuinely grave. The arrow through his lung in India alone would have been enough to end a lesser man, and perhaps had already begun its long, slow work on even this one. Some have suggested illness contracted in the marshes and waterways he had been moving through in the weeks before. Some, with the particular relish that surrounds all great mysterious deaths, have whispered of poison, and the name of one courtier or another has been put forward over the centuries with varying degrees of conviction, though no proof has ever settled the question, and likely none ever will. The story goes that his body, after death, showed none of the signs of decomposition that would have been expected for several days, a detail that became layered with all kinds of meaning by later writers, though what it meant, if it meant anything at all, remains as uncertain as most things about those final days. What is known, or as close to known as the distance of centuries allows, is that on the 11th day of the month the Greeks called Daisios, in what we would now count as June of 323 years before the birth of Christ, Alexander of Macedon died in the palace of Babylon. He was 32 years old, and he had walked and ridden and sailed across more than 20,000 miles of the ancient world, from the green valleys of Macedonia to the banks of the Indus, and he left behind him an empire so vast that no single person after him would ever hold all of it, a collection of cities bearing his name, scattered from Egypt to the edges of Central Asia, and a question that his generals would spend the rest of their lives and considerable amounts of blood trying to answer, which was simply, what happens now? This is perhaps the truest thing that can be said about those final hours in Babylon, that a great and restless energy, which had been moving through the world for more than a decade, like a river that does not know how to be still, simply ceased. The torches burned on in the corridors. The Euphrates moved past the city walls in the darkness below, unhurried, indifferent, carrying its ancient water south toward the sea, as it had always done and would continue to do long after every name spoken in that palace had dissolved into the generalized silence of history. The city breathed around the stillness in that room, and the stars moved slowly over Babylon, and somewhere in the camps outside the walls, a fire burned low and was not rebuilt, and the men who had followed him to the edge of the world sat with the particular kind of silence that has no words adequate to fill it. Rest here a moment with all of that, with the soft weight of an ending that was also in its strange way a beginning, because an empire left without a hand to hold it is not simply an absence but a new and complicated presence. And in the chapter that waits just ahead, we will gather all of these threads together gently, not to pull them tight, but simply to lay them beside one another in the quiet, the way one might spread out the maps of a long journey, and let the eye move slowly over the distances traveled, with nothing more required of you than to breathe, and to let the torchlight of all those ancient years burn softly, warmly, somewhere just behind your closing eyes. The lamps have burned low now, and the oil is nearly spent, and somewhere between the telling and the silence, a life has passed through this room like a river finding its way at last to the sea. It began, as so many lives do, not with thunder, but with quiet, with a highland kingdom tucked among cold mountains, with the smell of pine resin and wood smoke drifting through stone corridors, with a boy born into a world that was already restless with ambition and already old with the weight of its own stories. Macedonia was a rough and complicated place, wind-scoured and proud, and the court at Pella was nothing like the polished marble halls that later painters and poets would imagine for it. It was noisy and wine-stained and alive, full of soldiers who ate with their hands and debated with their knives, full of women whose political intelligence never found its way into the histories that survived them, full of a king, Philip, broad-shouldered and relentless, who was quietly, methodically building something that the world had not yet seen, Into that world came Alexander, a small bright flame of a child, it is said, whose hair caught the light like hammered gold, who asked questions before he had fully learned to walk, who already loved horses and heroes and the long stories that come out of the dark when the fire is burning low. He was from the beginning someone who lived as though the world were a story written just for him, and perhaps that was the gift his upbringing gave him, and perhaps it was also the wound. There was the garden at Mysa, soft with the sound of bees and rustling leaves, where Aristotle walked slowly and spoke softly, and laid before his young student the whole architecture of the known world, medicine and philosophy, and the habits of animals, and the nature of the soul. Those years were unhurried years, years of shade and patience, and something planted there, in the soil of Alexander's mind, took root and kept growing long after the lessons were finished, long after the garden was left behind and the road opened eastward, and the lamps of philosophy were traded for the torches of war. He was still a young man when the world began to ask things of him that no young man should have to answer. His father died violently, suddenly, in a spray of blood and confusion at a wedding celebration, and Alexander inherited not a stable kingdom, but a collection of rivals and restless allies and enemies who had been waiting years for exactly this moment. He moved against them all with a swiftness that left even his supporters breathless, riding north into the Balkans, riding south into Greece, standing before the rubble of Thebes as a lesson written in stone and ash for anyone who wished to read it. It was not his most graceful chapter, but it was the chapter that made the chapters after it possible. And then, the sea. The crossing of the Hellespont on that gray spring morning, standing at the prow, it is said, in his armor, hurling a spear onto the Asian shore as though claiming a continent by right of the throw, was the hinge upon which everything turned. Before that moment, he was a Macedonian king. After it, he became something else, something harder to name, something that history has been arguing about ever since. The battles came quickly at first, the Granicus, Issus, each one a place where the world might have tilted the other way, where a different spear throw or a different turn of fortune might have ended everything. But they did not tilt. The battles were won. The Persian king fled and fled again, and Darius, proud, bewildered, unlucky Darius, became a ghost of himself long before he became an actual ghost. There were the cities, so many cities, each one a world unto itself. Gordium, with its knotted rope and its old prophecy, and the clean sound of a blade cutting through what patience could not untangle. The Ionian coast, where Greek-speaking people leaned from their doorways and watched the army pass and wept, it is said, with something that felt like relief. Egypt, golden and ancient and smelling of the river, where Alexander walked into the temple at Siwa and came out changed in some way that no one around him could quite describe, carrying a secret between himself and whatever voice had spoken to him in the dark. And Alexandria, that dream city, scratched into the sand with the tip of a spear, a city that had not yet existed and would outlast almost everything. Rising in the imagination before the first stone was ever laid, a lantern set down at the edge of the water to light the way for 1,000 years of learning. The Persian heartland opened like a wound. Persepolis was everything the Greeks had ever imagined, as the center of the world that was not theirs. Monumental, perfumed, staggering in its wealth and its beauty, and then it burned, slowly and terribly, the smoke rising into the sky above the plain, the flames reflected in the eyes of men who were not sure, even as they watched, whether they had done something triumphant or something they would spend the rest of their lives trying to forget. Beyond Persia, the world grew stranger and harder and further from everything familiar. Bactria, Sogdia, the high, cold passes of what we now call Afghanistan, where the wind came down from the mountains like a blade, and the soldiers pulled their cloaks tighter and thought of home. There was Roxana, a young woman from those highlands, and Alexander chose her for his wife, with a simplicity that surprised his court. And whatever passed between them, tenderness, distance, something more complicated than either, has been debated and imagined and romanticized ever since without resolution, which perhaps means it was simply human in the way that the most intimate things always are. And then India, enormous and green and noisy with life, with its elephants and its monsoon rains, and its kings who met the army at the riverbank on war platforms of moving ivory. The Hydaspes, the battle and the driving rain, the elephants and the terrible noise, and the hours that felt, even in the winning of them, like something being spent that could never quite be replenished. And afterwards, the river that said no, not a river in the geography, but the river in the hearts of 30,000 men who had been walking east for 8 years, and who stood at last on the far side of exhaustion and would not take one more step. He wept, it is said, or he locked himself in his tent for days and would speak to no one, or both, and then he turned because the world had said, "This is where you stop," and he listened, which may have been the most human thing he ever did. The road home broke many things. The Gedrosian desert swallowed men and animals and certainty in equal measure, and by the time Babylon rose on the horizon, the army that arrived was a different thing from the army that had left. The king himself was a different thing, older, heavier with it all, full of plans that kept spilling out of him, even as something in his body was beginning quietly to fail. Babylon was warm and fragrant and golden, and in its lamplight, a fever rose in him that nothing could bring down. He lingered for days, attended, watched, whispered over, and then one evening the light in him simply went out, as lamps do when the oil is gone, without drama, without a final word the sources can agree upon. He was 32 years old, and he had walked, on foot and horseback, something like 22,000 miles, and the world he left behind was permanently and irreversibly altered in every direction he had touched. The shape of his life, held gently at a distance, is the shape of a flame, narrow in the beginning, widening into brightness, reaching and reaching for what it cannot quite touch, and then growing still. There is something in it that asks to be wondered at without being fully understood, a life that resists the tidy edges of a lesson. He was brilliant and cruel and generous and lonely and lost and found and lost again, and he was very young for all of it, and the mountains where he was born caught their first snow each year long after he was gone, as though the world simply continued, which of course it did, as the world always does. Rest now in the soft dark after the story. Let the lamplight of those ancient places fade slowly at the edges of your mind, and let the warmth of it remain, the golden glow of a world that was and passed and is still somehow here, carried forward in every telling. You have traveled a long way tonight. Set it all down now. Let sleep come as gently as oil spreading across still water, as warmth spreading from a flame that has done its work and earned its quiet.